2 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my mother-in-law showed up unannounced with a moving truck and hauled her boxes straight into my master bedroom. My fiancé not only helped her settle in, but actually expected me to sleep on the couch to accommodate her. The note I left them the next morning changed absolutely everything. My name is Allison. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder and lead director of a financial forensics firm. My daily work involves tracking down missing millions, exposing corporate fraud, and sending white-collar criminals to federal prison. I deal with master manipulators for a living, professionally, methodically, and without emotion. But somehow, I had completely missed the two biggest parasites feeding right under my own roof. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a firm, uncompromising boundary with toxic in-laws who genuinely believed they could walk all over you. It was a Friday evening in early October, exactly 48 hours before I was supposed to marry Brandon. Brandon was a 34-year-old regional sales director who always wore expensive tailored suits, flashed a disarming charismatic smile, and carried himself as though he personally owned every room he walked into. I had purchased my 5-bedroom, $1.5 million home in the Chicago suburbs entirely in cash, 2 full years before I even met him. I had spent nearly a decade working 80-hour weeks building my firm from the ground up, tracing hidden assets, analyzing shell companies, and testifying in high-stakes federal court cases. I bought that house as a testament to my own relentless hard work, a physical monument to every sacrifice I had made. That evening, I had just finished 12 exhausting hours auditing a corrupt pharmaceutical company. My brain was completely fried, my feet were aching, and all I wanted in the world was a scalding hot shower and a generous pour of expensive red wine. But as I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street, I slammed on my brakes. A massive rental moving truck was parked illegally, half blocking my driveway and half crushing the pristine front lawn I paid a landscaping company thousands of dollars a year to maintain. The back of the truck was wide open, and standing on the loading ramp was my fiancé Brandon, sweating through his designer polo shirt while struggling with a heavy cardboard box. I parked my car along the curb and walked slowly toward the house, my forensic mind already cataloging every detail. The boxes were labeled things like Brenda's summer wardrobe and Brenda's kitchen knickknacks. Brenda was Brandon's mother, a 62-year-old woman who treated every family gathering like her personal coronation ceremony and treated me like an overpaid, underqualified servant. Brandon caught sight of me as I approached the porch steps. He froze for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible flash of guilt crossing his face before he plastered on his signature salesman's smile. "Allison, babe, you're home early." He chuckled nervously, shifting the heavy box in his arms. "Surprise! We're doing a little emergency moving situation." I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, arms folded tightly across my chest. "What exactly is going on here, Brandon? Why is your mother's entire life packed into a truck sitting on my lawn 2 days before our wedding?" He let out a loud, theatrical sigh, perfectly playing the role of the devoted but beleaguered son. "It's a total disaster, babe. Mom's landlord is an absolute jerk. He just terminated her lease out of nowhere, completely blindsided her. She had to be out by noon today. I couldn't just leave her on the street, right? She's going to stay with us for a little while until she gets back on her feet. You know how insane the rental market is right now." My eyes narrowed. Brenda lived in a luxury high-rise in downtown Chicago. Landlords simply do not terminate leases out of nowhere, not without months of prior written warnings or serious, documented lease violations. And even if that had somehow happened, Brenda supposedly had considerable money of her own. She bragged incessantly at family gatherings about her stock portfolio and her comfortable early retirement. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice dangerously, deliberately calm. "She's upstairs getting settled in," Brandon said, brushing past me through the front door. "Come on, be nice to her. She's really fragile right now." I followed him inside, my heels clicking sharply and deliberately against the hardwood floor. I bypassed the perfectly adequate guest rooms on the first floor and walked up the sweeping staircase to the second level. As I approached the master suite, I heard a heavy thud followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. I stepped into the doorway of my master bedroom and stopped dead in my tracks. Brenda was standing in the center of my bedroom, surrounded by her half-unpacked boxes, but that was not what made my blood boil. Brenda had opened my custom walk-in closet and was systematically, methodically, pulling out my expensive, hard-earned leather work bags and tossing them carelessly into the hallway. My designer briefcases and tote bags, pieces I had purchased to mark major milestones in my company's growth, were piled on the floor like discarded garbage. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, stepping firmly into the room. Brenda did not even flinch. She turned around slowly, looked me up and down with an expression of mild, barely concealed annoyance, and pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward my closet. "Oh good, you're home. You have far too much unused space in here, Allison. I'm moving my seasonal wardrobe into this section, so you'll need to clear out those shelves entirely. And honestly, you should tell your housekeeper to dust the top racks. It is absolutely filthy up there." I stared at her, genuinely struggling to process the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the moment. "You are throwing my belongings out of my closet, in my house." "It's our house now, Allison," Brenda corrected me smoothly, waving her hand as though swatting away an inconvenient fly. "Brandon lives here, and soon you'll be married. Family shares. Besides, I am going through a terrible personal crisis and I need to be comfortable while I recover." Brandon hurried into the room and set his box down near the foot of my bed. "Mom, maybe we should put your things in the guest room down the hall." "Absolutely not," Brenda snapped, planting her hands firmly on her hips. "The guest bed is a queen. You know perfectly well I have a bad back, Brandon. I need a king-size mattress with proper lumbar support. My chiropractor specifically prescribed it." She turned her sharp gaze back to me, her eyes cold and calculating. "You and Brandon are young and resilient. You can take the guest room, or better yet, sleep on the sectional sofa in the living room tonight. Brandon and I have been moving boxes all day, and he needs his rest before the wedding rehearsal tomorrow. You just sit at a desk all day anyway." I looked at Brandon, waiting, fully expecting, for him to shut this madness down immediately. I waited for the man I was supposed to marry in 48 hours to tell his mother that she was completely out of her mind, that she could not commandeer the master bedroom of a house I had purchased entirely with my own money, that she most certainly could not instruct me to sleep on my own sofa in my own home. Instead, Brandon looked at the floor, rubbed the back of his neck, and offered me a pleading, pathetic, utterly spineless look. "Come on, Allison," he mumbled quietly. "Just for a little while. Mom's been crying all morning. Have a little heart. Can you just be flexible? Just this once?" The silence that stretched through the master bedroom was heavy and suffocating. A lesser woman might have screamed. A different woman might have cried, thrown a dramatic tantrum, or started hurling Brenda's boxes out the window onto the lawn below. But I was not a lesser woman. I was a financial forensic investigator with 15 years of experience dismantling carefully constructed lies. When someone presents me with a story that makes absolutely no logical sense, I do not get emotional. I look for the hidden ledger. I follow the money. I find the truth. I looked at my designer bags piled on the hallway floor, then at Brenda's smug, self-satisfied face, then at Brandon's cowardly, hunched posture. They thought they had cornered me. They genuinely believed that the looming pressure of a wedding 48 hours away would force me into silent submission. They thought I would simply roll over and comply. To keep the peace? To avoid the scene? To play the accommodating, flexible future wife? Okay, I said quietly, my voice perfectly, unnervingly even. Brandon exhaled a massive sigh of pure relief. Thank you, babe. I knew you'd understand. You are honestly the best. Of course, I replied, offering a smile that did not remotely reach my eyes. Take the bed, Brenda. Make yourself completely at home. I'll just grab my laptop and a few essentials. I have some late-night work to catch up on anyway. I picked up my tossed bags from the hallway floor with measured, deliberate calm. I retrieved my computer from my briefcase, and I walked downstairs to my private home office. I locked the door behind me and sat down at my mahogany desk. I did not pull out a blanket for the sofa. I opened my specialized auditing software. Brandon had made a fatal, irreversible error. In his rush to play the role of the generous, big-hearted husband, he had previously given me full access to his primary computer to help him file his taxes the previous year. He had absolutely no idea what kind of comprehensive digital footprint he had left behind, or what a woman with my precise, particular skill set could do with unrestricted access to it. I poured myself a glass of water, cracked my knuckles, and began to dig. By morning, there would be no wedding. There would only be a spectacular, meticulously documented, utterly unmitigated destruction. Brandon did not let me walk away quietly. He followed me down the sweeping wooden staircase, his leather-soled shoes padding softly behind my sharp heels. He knew I was furious, but his colossal ego had convinced him, as it always did, that he could smooth-talk his way out of absolutely anything. He was a regional sales director after all. His entire professional career had been built on selling people things they did not need, did not ask for, and would later deeply regret. Now he was attempting to sell me the idea that being forcibly ousted from my own master bedroom was somehow an act of profound, selfless familial love. Allison, wait. Just stop for a second, he called out, catching my arm just as I reached the door of my home office. I turned around slowly, deliberately, my eyes dropping to where his hand gripped my sleeve. He released me immediately, stepping back and raising both hands in a practiced gesture of surrender. Don't walk away angry, he said, lowering his voice into that soft, practiced, placating tone he deployed whenever he needed to win an argument by making the other person feel unreasonable. We are getting married in 48 hours. This is supposed to be the happiest, most important weekend of our lives. Don't let this one thing ruin everything we've built. Mom is just under an enormous amount of stress right now. I stood there studying him, my gaze tracing the handsome face I had fallen so deeply in love with 2 years ago. I asked him a simple, direct question, the kind I ask in boardrooms when the numbers don't add up. Why did you not call me, Brandon? Why did you not send a single text message, not even one brief word, warning me that your mother was about to move her entire life into my house? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The charming, carefully constructed facade slipped, peeling back like a mask to reveal the defensive, entitled man hiding underneath. It all happened so fast, Allison. I was busy renting the truck and coordinating the packing of her things. And honestly, I already knew you would overreact exactly the way you are doing right now. I am overreacting, I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously, deliberately level, because a woman who openly disrespects me is currently sleeping in my bed. It is our bed, Brandon snapped, his volume rising sharply as his frustration crested. We are getting married. What is yours is mine. This is our house, Allison. We are supposed to be a partnership. We are a team. A team. The word echoed in the quiet hallway like a stone dropped into still water. I almost laughed out loud at the sheer, breathtaking delusion packed inside that single statement. I had purchased this multi-million-dollar estate entirely in cash before I even knew his last name. I paid the exorbitant property taxes every year without complaint, carried the premium homeowner's insurance, and spent thousands of dollars maintaining the landscaping and the daily upkeep that kept this property immaculate. My forensic accounting firm had funded every single luxury within these walls, from the imported Italian marble countertops gleaming in the kitchen to the custom security system quietly guarding every entrance. Brandon, on the other hand, contributed exactly $800 a month. That was his self-proclaimed, proudly announced share of the household expenses. He insisted on paying it with great ceremony to protect his sense of masculinity, claiming it covered utilities and groceries. In reality, he routinely consumed well over $800 a month in premium imported beers, organic steaks, and expensive sports streaming subscriptions he treated as non-negotiable essentials. His financial contribution was a microscopic rounding error in my budget, barely a footnote. Yet here he stood in my foyer, his chest broad and his chin lifted, boldly claiming co-ownership of a fortress I had built brick by brick with my own blood, sweat, and intelligence. "I contribute to this household," Brandon continued, puffing out his chest as though he could somehow sense my thoughts. "I pay $800 every single month without fail. I am not some freeloader, Allison. I am the man of this house. You are acting like a cold-blooded accountant right now. Do not look at my mother like she is some negative line item on a spreadsheet. She is a human being who just lost her home. She is going to be your family. Have some sympathy for once in your life." He threw the words at me like carefully aimed weapons, fully expecting them to find their mark. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to feel guilty for being successful, for being logical, for being fiercely protective of my own sanctuary. This was his signature gaslighting maneuver, one I had seen him deploy before but never quite so brazenly. Whenever he crossed a boundary, he immediately flipped the script, recasting himself as the reasonable victim and making me the villain simply for daring to notice the boundary had been crossed at all. He wanted me to believe that demanding basic respect made me a heartless, calculating machine devoid of human feeling. But when people reach for guilt as a weapon, they are almost always concealing something far darker underneath. In my line of work, I have sat across the table from corporate executives who attempted this exact same tactic. When I catch them embezzling millions, they do not confess quietly and immediately. Instead, they get angry. They deflect with remarkable speed. They insist I cannot possibly understand the immense pressure they operate under, or they accuse me of being constitutionally incapable of human empathy. Brandon was running the exact same playbook, word for word. He was working to make me feel terrible about protecting my own property so that I would not look too carefully at the real reason his mother had suddenly been evicted. Landlords do not remove wealthy retirees from their homes on a Friday morning for absolutely no reason. There was a missing piece to this puzzle, and Brandon was shouting as loudly as he could to keep me from searching for it. I stood perfectly still and let his angry words hang in the heavy air between us. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not recite my massive financial contributions or remind him that his $800 barely covered the electricity bill during Chicago's brutal, freezing winters. Arguing with a parasite is a complete waste of energy and clarity. You do not negotiate with a tick. You simply extract it. Instead of fighting back, I looked at his flushed, agitated face and did the precise opposite of what he expected. I smiled. It was a slow, deliberate, chilling smile that never came close to reaching my eyes. "You are absolutely right, Brandon," I said softly, my voice carrying an eerie, unnatural calm. "We are getting married in 2 days. Family shares everything. We are a team. I should absolutely be more accommodating to your mother during her time of need." Brandon blinked, thrown completely off guard by my sudden, seamless compliance. The anger drained visibly from his face, replaced almost instantly by a triumphant, self-satisfied smirk. He actually believed he had won. He genuinely believed his clumsy emotional manipulation had broken through my resolve and softened me into submission. Exactly, babe. He exhaled a long, relieved breath and stepped forward to pull me into a hug. I sidestepped his embrace smoothly, clutching my laptop firmly against my chest like a shield. "I will sleep on the sofa downstairs," I told him pleasantly. "You go back upstairs and get some rest. Like you said, tomorrow is a big day. You have the rehearsal dinner and you need to be fresh." He beamed at me, completely and utterly oblivious to the quiet danger lurking just beneath my agreeable tone. "Thank you, Allison. I promise this is just temporary. You are going to make a beautiful bride." "Good night, Brandon," I said. I watched him turn and jog happily back up the staircase, eager to return to the master suite he had so generously gifted to his mother. He thought he had secured his luxurious future. He thought he had successfully maneuvered the wealthy, independent woman into the role of a compliant, silent wife who would not ask uncomfortable questions. The moment he disappeared from view, my smile vanished entirely. The icy resolve flooded back into my veins like cold water. I turned the brass handle of my office door, stepped inside the darkened room, and locked the heavy oak door firmly behind me. I did not walk to the sofa. I walked directly to my desk, opened my laptop, and watched the screen cast its cold light across the dark room. If Brandon wanted to call me a cold-blooded accountant, I was more than happy to embrace the role completely. It was time to audit my fiancé. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside what I privately thought of as my command center. The room was soundproofed, a feature I had specifically insisted upon when I first purchased the estate, ensuring absolute, uninterrupted silence for the kind of complex, high-stakes investigations my work demanded. I did not bother with the overhead lights. The cold blue glow of my triple monitor setup illuminated the space sufficiently, casting long shadows across the bookshelves and filing cabinets lining the walls. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, cracked my knuckles with quiet deliberation, and woke up the servers. Brandon thought I was a cold-blooded accountant. He was about to discover precisely how accurate that description truly was. My firm utilized proprietary forensic auditing software, the sophisticated kind that interfaces directly with federal databases, public record archives, and global banking registries. To the average person, hiding money or concealing a financial disaster might seem straightforward, even achievable. To me, a digital paper trail was as visible and unmistakable as glowing neon footprints pressed deep into fresh snow. Last spring, Brandon had handed over his personal laptop and a thick folder of financial documents, practically begging me to file his taxes because he claimed the software thoroughly confused him. That single act of careless laziness had given me everything I needed. I had his routing numbers, his primary bank account details, and a detailed baseline of his financial habits and patterns. I opened a new encrypted file on my desktop and typed in his full name, followed by his mother's name. I decided to begin with Brenda. Brandon had spun an elaborate, sympathetic story about a ruthless, heartless landlord abruptly terminating her lease without warning or cause. That narrative had felt incredibly flimsy from the moment the words left his mouth. In Illinois, tenant protections are robust and well-established. Landlords cannot simply remove a senior citizen from her home with no notice unless there is severe, extensively documented legal cause. I tapped into Cook County public property records and ran a comprehensive search on Brenda's supposedly rented downtown high-rise. The results populated on my screen almost instantly, and I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed softly in the empty room. Brenda did not rent that condominium. She had owned it. Or rather, She had owned it until the bank moved to seize it through formal foreclosure proceedings. I pulled up the county court dockets and methodically sifted through the filings. Brenda had not paid her mortgage in over 14 consecutive months. The bank had issued multiple notices, extended multiple grace periods out of legal obligation, and ultimately initiated a formal eviction protocol after exhausting every available avenue. Yesterday morning was not a sudden, unexpected tragedy. It was the scheduled, legally mandated lockout date, executed on the courthouse steps by the county sheriff precisely on schedule. But where had all her money gone? Brenda constantly boasted loudly and proudly about her early retirement and her supposedly lucrative, well-diversified stock portfolio. I dug deeper, accessing civil court records and lien registries with practiced efficiency. The truth, when it finally emerged, was not remotely glamorous. There was no diverse, carefully managed stock portfolio. There were only massive, crippling, compounding debts. The records showed multiple liens filed by various collection agencies and, far more revealing, by a prominent casino resort corporation headquartered just across the state line. Brenda was not the victim of a cruel, opportunistic landlord. She was a severe gambling addict who had quite literally bet her entire home away, dollar by dollar, at the blackjack tables and slot machines. I sat back slowly in my chair, the blue light washing cool and steady across my face. So Brandon had known with complete certainty that his mother was about to be evicted by the county sheriff. Yet he had orchestrated this entire elaborate circus to cast her as a helpless victim, carefully manipulating me into allowing a chronic gambling addict to take up residence in my home without my knowledge or consent. But a persistent, nagging question continued to press at the back of my mind with quiet insistence. Brandon drew a decent salary as a regional sales director. Why had he not simply paid down her mortgage arrears to preserve her condominium? Why the urgent, chaotic midnight move? I toggled over to Brandon's financial profile and ran a quiet, careful trace on his primary checking account. What I found there stopped me cold. His balance was shockingly, almost incomprehensibly low for a man who dressed and spoke as though money were no object. He was living entirely paycheck to paycheck, spending liberally on luxury car leases, expensive watches, and tailored custom suits, carefully designed to project an image of wealth he did not actually possess. He carried absolutely no liquid savings, nothing even remotely sufficient to bail out his mother or cover her mounting debts. My heart rate held steady, but a cold, heavy knot formed quietly in my stomach. If Brandon had no accessible money, how exactly was he financing this sudden emergency relocation? Moving trucks, storage units, and paying off Brenda's most pressing creditors all required immediate substantial cash. A deeply unsettling suspicion crept into my mind with the slow, deliberate certainty of inevitability. I opened my personal secure portal and initiated a full, comprehensive hard pull on my own credit report from all three major bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, simultaneously. I am meticulously careful about my finances under normal circumstances, conducting thorough quarterly reviews as a matter of professional habit. But the all-consuming demands of wedding planning had displaced my usual discipline over the past 2 months. The report generated on my center screen within seconds. I stared at the numbers, my breathing stopping completely. There were 2 new accounts listed under my name, 2 platinum-tier credit cards carrying $50,000 limits each. Both accounts had been opened exactly 6 weeks prior. Both cards were currently maxed out to their absolute limits. I clicked through to the account details, my eyes scanning every field of billing information with razor precision. The address linked to both cards was a private post office box registered in Brandon's name. But the social security number used to secure those 2 massive lines of credit was mine. Brandon had stolen my social security number. The man I was scheduled to marry in less than 48 hours had committed federal identity theft against me. I bypassed the credit bureaus entirely and used my forensic access credentials to pull the full, itemized transaction histories for both fraudulent accounts. The statements that materialized on my screen were a detailed roadmap of desperation, cowardice, and cold-blooded betrayal. He had used my stolen credit to pay off $30,000 of Brenda's most urgent casino markers, neutralizing a separate threatened lawsuit before it could be filed. He had charged the moving truck rental to my name. He had even purchased her an entirely new designer wardrobe to replace the clothing and personal items she had been forced to abandon during the rushed foreclosure lockout. He was funding his hero complex and bankrolling his mother's ruinous gambling addiction using my pristine, carefully protected credit score as his personal emergency fund. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the office was the gentle, rhythmic hum of my computer's cooling fans turning steadily in the dark. I did not shed a single tear. I felt no urge to scream or sweep things from my desk in a burst of rage. In my profession, the discovery of fraud does not provoke hysteria or emotional collapse. It provokes something altogether different: a predatory, surgical, absolute focus. Brandon thought he was clever. He thought that the intimacy and legal weight of our engagement allowed him to blur the carefully maintained boundaries between our finances, and that he could quietly ask for forgiveness once the damage was already done. He assumed that once the marriage certificate was signed on Sunday, our assets would legally merge, and his massive criminal theft would dissolve seamlessly into the shared complexity of marital finances. He was banking on my emotional commitment to the wedding, on my desire to preserve everything we had built together, to shield him permanently from the full consequences of what he had done. He had miscalculated catastrophically. This was no longer simply a boundary dispute with a difficult future mother-in-law. I was living under the same roof as a felon. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. I began downloading every single document, every transaction timestamp, every IP address log definitively proving he had executed the fraudulent applications directly from his personal device. I compiled the foreclosure notices, the casino liens, and the complete credit card statements into a single, comprehensive master dossier. I encrypted the file with military-grade protocols and mirrored it simultaneously to 3 separate secure cloud servers on different continents. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner of my screen. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. The wedding rehearsal was scheduled for the following evening. I closed the forensic software, the evidence sealed and locked away safely in my digital vault. I leaned back in my chair and stared up at the dark ceiling of my office, letting the silence settle around me. Brandon and Brenda were sleeping soundly upstairs in my master bedroom, wrapped in expensive sheets that belonged to me, entirely confident that they had already won. They believed they had successfully secured a lifetime of comfort and luxury, quietly financed by the accommodating, compliant woman they assumed was sleeping peacefully downstairs. They were about to learn, with absolute finality, that you never, under any circumstances, steal from a woman who destroys financial criminals for a living. The blue light of my monitors cast long, sharp shadows across the walls of my soundproofed office. The digital clock ticked forward to exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I was still sitting there, motionless, staring at the irrefutable, meticulously documented proof of Brandon committing felony identity theft, when the silence was shattered by a sharp, sudden vibration against the mahogany desk. My private cell phone, a number I shared exclusively with high-level clients and immediate family, was buzzing insistently. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Terrence. Terrence was Brandon's brother-in-law, married to Brandon's younger sister Vanessa. He was a brilliant certified public accountant, a meticulous and hard-working man who had always seemed entirely too decent to be genuinely associated with that family. At holiday dinners and family gatherings, Terrence and I had a quiet, unspoken habit of gravitating toward each other, finding corners of the room to discuss tax law and market trends, while Brandon and Vanessa loudly dominated every conversation around them. We were the outsiders in that family. We were the ones who had actually built something with our own hands. A call at 2 o'clock in the morning was completely and entirely out of character for him. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. "Terrence," I said, keeping my voice carefully low. "Is everything all right, Allison? Listen to me very carefully." His voice came through the speaker as a harsh, urgent whisper, stripped of its usual easy warmth. "Are you in a secure room? Can anyone hear you?" "I am locked in my home office," I replied, my forensic instincts shifting immediately into high alert. "Brandon and his mother are asleep upstairs. What is going on?" "Check your secure encrypted email portal," Terrence said, his breathing shallow and rapid, as though he had been moving quickly through a dark house. "I just sent a data packet to the address we used when we consulted on that corporate merger last year. You need to open it right now." I did not waste time asking questions. I pulled up the encrypted portal, bypassed the two-factor authentication with practiced efficiency, and found a newly deposited file waiting. I downloaded it, unzipped the contents, and opened the first PDF document. My eyes moved rapidly across the dense legal language, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. It was a prenuptial agreement, but it had been drastically, surgically altered beyond recognition. It bore no resemblance whatsoever to the standard mutual protection document Brandon and I had briefly discussed and mutually dismissed months ago. This was a predatory, unilateral contract engineered with one singular purpose: to strip me of everything I had spent a decade building. "What am I looking at, Terrence?" I asked, my voice dropping to that particular register I reserved for the most serious moments in my career. "That is a modified post-nuptial transfer agreement," Terrence whispered, his voice carrying an unmistakable mixture of barely contained rage and deep, bone-tired exhaustion. "Brandon and Vanessa paid a disreputable paralegal to draft it last week. They disguised the title page to make it appear like standard liability insurance waivers for the wedding venue." I scrolled methodically down to the execution clauses. The document stated explicitly and without ambiguity that upon signing, I would irrevocably transfer 50% ownership of my financial forensics firm and 50% equity in my residential estate directly to Brandon, bypassing every standard legal waiting period and review process entirely. How exactly did they plan to obtain my signature on this without me reading it? I demanded, though some cold, instinctive part of me was already beginning to understand. "That is the most disturbing part," Terrence replied, his voice dropping further. "Vanessa has been coordinating directly with the bartender at your wedding reception venue. They plan to ensure you received heavily spiked drinks throughout the entire evening, hour after hour. They were going to wait until you were completely incapacitated, bring you back to the bridal suite, and present you with papers they would describe as an emergency noise ordinance waiver required by the venue manager. They were prepared to physically guide your hand if necessary." A wave of pure, cold disgust moved through me from head to foot. They were not merely thieves operating out of desperation. They were calculated, patient predators. They had looked at my life, my business, and my home, and seen nothing but a hostile acquisition target. And they had been entirely willing to drug me, at my own wedding, to execute their scheme. "How did you find this?" I asked. "Vanessa got careless," Terrence said, and the heartbreak sitting beneath those 4 quiet words was unmistakable and devastating. "She left her laptop open on the kitchen island tonight. I saw the email thread between her and Brandon. They were celebrating, Allison. They were openly bragging to each other about how they had finally secured the bag. He paused, and I heard the faint sound of a door clicking shut on his end of the line, followed by a long, heavy sigh of exhausted defeat. But that is not everything I found. I started pulling our own joint account records, Terrence continued, his voice quieter now, steadier but hollowed out. I am a CPA, Allison. I should have seen it long ago. The signs were there and I missed every single one of them. But she is my wife, and I trusted her completely. He exhaled. Vanessa used my professional credentials to open 3 separate secret lines of credit over the past year. She placed $50,000 of fraudulent debt directly onto my name. My chest tightened with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite anger, but an intimate, painful blend of the two. We were mirroring each other in our respective parallel tragedies. Both of us were highly educated financial professionals, people who spent their careers identifying exactly this kind of fraud, and we had both been rendered completely blind by trust and by love. Where did the money go? I asked, though I already knew the answer before the words had fully left my mouth. To Brenda, Terrence confirmed, his voice turning hard and bitter as stone. Brenda has a catastrophic gambling addiction. She lost her condominium to foreclosure. Brandon and Vanessa have been scrambling frantically for months to cover her tracks, siphoning money from you and from me to keep her out of court and maintain the illusion of their wealthy, respectable family image. We are nothing but financial instruments to them, Allison. We are the cash reserves they brought in specifically to drain. I stared at the fraudulent contract still illuminated on my screen. The anger that had been quietly, steadily simmering inside me since the moment I first saw Brandon's mother standing in my foyer had now cooled and hardened into something far more dangerous than heat. It had become a weapon, precise, unyielding, and absolutely unbreakable. They had chosen the wrong woman, and they had also, quite decisively, chosen the wrong man. Terrence, I said, my voice carrying a ring of absolute, unhurried authority. Are you ready to burn their entire house of cards to the ground? I am done, Allison. I am completely and entirely done, he replied. The exhaustion that had weighted every word moments before was gone, replaced suddenly by a fierce, quiet, irrevocable resolve. I have downloaded every bank statement, every forged application, and every email thread in that correspondence chain. I have everything saved on a physical encrypted hard drive. I am packing a bag right now. I am leaving before the sun comes up. Good, I said without hesitation. Take every vital document you can carry. Transfer your half of any legitimately shared funds before you walk out the door. Do not confront her. Do not give her a single opportunity to manipulate you or to destroy any portion of the evidence. You walk directly to your car and you drive to a hotel. Do you understand me? What are you going to do? He asked. I am going to do what I do best, I stated, adding the fraudulent post-nuptial agreement to my master evidence dossier with a single decisive keystroke. I am going to initiate a catastrophic, comprehensive audit. Tomorrow was supposed to be my wedding rehearsal. By noon, Brandon and Brenda will be wishing they had never learned how to spell my name. I will call Harrison the moment the sun rises. We are going to need airtight, aggressive legal representation to execute every component of this properly. Harrison was my corporate attorney, a ruthless, extraordinarily brilliant legal mind who had spent 30 years specializing in financial fraud prosecution and asset recovery litigation. He was going to have an absolute field day with the material I was about to drop in his lap. Thank you, Terrence, I added, and for just a moment my voice softened at its edges. You saved my life tonight. You saved my company. We save each other, Allison, Terrence replied, his voice steady and certain. We are the only real family either of us has left in any of this. Give them hell tomorrow. I ended the call and set the phone gently on the mahogany desk. The clock read 2:30 in the morning. I had been betrayed, financially violated, and deliberately targeted for a sophisticated, multi-layered criminal scheme by the man I was scheduled to marry. My future mother-in-law was sleeping peacefully in my bed upstairs, dreaming of the empire she believed she had already conquered. Brandon was sprawled contentedly in my master suite, certain that tomorrow's rehearsal dinner was the last peaceful stop before a lifetime of wealth he had done absolutely nothing to earn. I did not feel heartbroken anymore. I felt powerful. I cracked my knuckles one final time, opened a clean blank document, and began composing the note I would leave on the kitchen island in the morning. It was time, with great precision and no small amount of satisfaction, to set the trap. The clock read 2:45 when I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had never once called outside of standard business hours. Harrison did not answer on the first ring. He was 55 years old, a decorated veteran of Chicago's most brutal and high-profile corporate litigation battles, and he guarded his sleep with the same fierce dedication he brought to a courtroom. But he also understood, with 30 years of hard experience behind him, that if I was calling him at this hour, then a financial catastrophe of serious proportions was actively unfolding and required his immediate merciless attention. He picked up on the fourth ring. His voice was graveled with sleep but instantly alert. "Allison, tell me someone is going to federal prison." "Someone is going to federal prison, Harrison," I replied, keeping my voice low and steady. "In fact, make that a full family reunion in federal prison. I need you at your computer right now. We are executing an emergency asset lockdown and a hostile corporate eviction, and we have exactly 9 hours before I need law enforcement standing at my front door." I heard the immediate rustle of heavy sheets being thrown back, followed by the solid thud of his feet hitting the floor without hesitation. "Give me 30 seconds, he said. "Talk while I boot the secure servers." What exactly did the groom-to-be do to earn a call at this hour? I outlined everything with surgical, methodical precision. I walked him through Brenda's deliberate occupation of my master bedroom to conceal her gambling-driven foreclosure. I detailed the 2 maxed-out platinum credit cards fraudulently opened against my stolen Social Security number. And finally, I described the forged post-nuptial transfer agreement that Terrence had intercepted, and the coordinated plan to render me unconscious with spiked drinks at my own wedding reception in order to steal half of my company and half of my real estate in a single signed document. For a prolonged moment, the only sound on the line was the rapid, mechanical rhythm of Harrison typing across his keyboard. When he finally spoke, every trace of his usual dry, sardonic edge had been completely stripped away. What remained was pure, concentrated, unfiltered legal fury. "They attempted to steal from a forensic auditor," Harrison said, exhaling a sharp breath that contained equal parts disbelief and professional outrage, "and a corporate attack dog. The absolute staggering arrogance of these people." A brief pause. "All right, Allison. We are going to dismantle them completely. Where do we begin?" "We freeze the credit first," I instructed, my fingers already moving across my own keyboard in parallel with his. "I am logging into the Direct Bureau portal right now. I am placing a hard, permanent freeze on my Social Security number. No new accounts, no inquiries, no modifications of any kind, effective immediately." "Done," Harrison confirmed. "I am pulling the federal fraud dispute forms for both active cards Brandon opened in your name. Filing them now under federal identity theft protocols. This triggers an automatic investigation by the fraud division. By the time Brandon attempts to buy his morning coffee tomorrow, those cards will be dead plastic in his wallet, and his private post office box will be flagged by federal authorities. Next is my company." I opened my firm's administrative dashboard with calm, methodical efficiency. Brandon had zero access to my professional accounts. He had never been anywhere near them. But I was taking absolutely zero chances tonight. I rotated every master password across every system, forced a global logout on all linked devices simultaneously, and instituted a strict biometric lock on the company's central financial ledger. No one was getting inside without my fingerprint and my face. I then logged into my personal banking portal. I stripped Brandon of his status as an authorized user on our minor joint account and swept the balance with surgical precision, leaving him exactly what he had originally contributed over the course of our entire engagement: $800. The rest of my millions retreated safely behind impenetrable, multi-tiered encryption protocols where they belonged. "You need to secure the physical assets immediately," Harrison advised, his voice crisp and sharp through the speaker. "Brandon and his mother are currently inside your property. If they wake up at any point and begin to suspect what is happening, they may resort to damaging the interior out of sheer spite. People cornered by their own greed tend to become destructive." "I am already one step ahead of you," I replied, pulling up the digital deed to my estate on the secondary monitor. "We are executing a rapid ownership transfer." For the past 3 months, I had been quietly building a corporate shell entity named Titan Property Management. It was originally intended as a clean holding structure for a commercial real estate acquisition I had been planning for the next fiscal quarter. Tonight, it was going to serve a far more immediate and considerably more satisfying purpose. "Harrison, I am transferring the deed of this estate from my personal name directly into the Titan Holding Company. I need you to push the digital notarization through the county clerk's emergency portal right now. You have the judicial contacts. Wake up whoever needs to be woken up and get this officially stamped before sunrise." Harrison let out a low, dark chuckle, a rich, satisfied sound that resonated through the phone. Transferring ownership to a corporate entity completely changes the legal landscape of their occupancy. If the house remains titled in your personal name, Brandon can mount an argument that he is a domestic partner with established residency rights. Evicting him through that route would require a formal 30-day notice and a prolonged, messy civil court battle. "Exactly," I confirmed. "But if the property is owned by Titan Property Management, a faceless, dispassionate corporate entity, then Brandon and Brenda are no longer difficult houseguests with any legal claim to the premises. They become unauthorized squatters occupying a commercial asset without permission or contract. And corporate evictions in this jurisdiction do not require a 30-day notice. They require a single call to the county sheriff for the immediate physical removal of hostile trespassers." "I am sending the transfer documents to the county clerk's emergency queue right now," Harrison said, his typing accelerating noticeably. "The digital notarization stamp will be verified and recorded by sunrise. Titan Property Management will officially own the estate. Now, how do we want to handle the eviction execution itself?" "Draft a formal notice of immediate termination of residency," I instructed. "Print it on your heaviest legal letterhead. Send a courier to the sheriff's department by 8 o'clock this morning. Request a police escort to enforce a noon eviction. Tell the sheriff that the corporate owner is formally reporting hostile occupants who are refusing to vacate commercial premises, and that the situation warrants immediate law enforcement presence." "Consider it done," Harrison said. "What is your next move?" "I am setting a trap," I said quietly, reaching into the deep side drawer of my mahogany desk. I retrieved a sleek silver USB flash drive and set it on the desk in front of me. I knew Brandon's habits with the intimacy that only comes from 2 years of close proximity. Once the eviction notice landed and the credit cards began declining, he would panic in a very specific, predictable way. He would scramble frantically for leverage, something he could hold over me, something that could force a negotiation and buy him time to slither out of the consequences closing in around him. He would inevitably try to breach my home office, desperate to locate financial records, client lists, or proprietary firm data. Anything he could threaten to expose or destroy to save himself. I plugged the silver drive into a completely quarantined virtual machine running on an isolated server. I quickly assembled a folder labeled Confidential, Prenup Draft and Client Financials. The title was carefully designed to be irresistible to a desperate, greedy man with a collapsing plan. But the files inside were not documents of any kind. They were an extremely aggressive, military-grade ransomware payload I kept securely isolated for the purpose of studying corporate cyber attack methodologies. If Brandon inserted this drive into any computer, his laptop, a borrowed device, anything with a USB port, the payload would deploy within seconds, locking the entire operating system and encrypting every server connected to the same network before the machine could even register what was happening. I placed the silver drive precisely in the center of my otherwise cleared desk, a single, shining, irresistible piece of bait positioned for a greedy and desperate rat. Outside my office window, the Chicago sky was beginning to surrender its deep black to the first pale, bruised grays and muted purples of early morning. My work was complete. The financial fortress was fully sealed. The legal weapons were loaded, carefully primed, and aimed with precision at the people sleeping upstairs in my bed. I closed my laptop and secured it in my leather briefcase with a quiet, definitive click. I stood up slowly and smoothed the wrinkles from my clothes. I felt no fatigue whatsoever, only a sharp, crystalline, electric energy pulsing steadily through my veins. I unlocked the heavy oak door and walked quietly down the hallway toward the kitchen. The house was perfectly, beautifully still. I stood at the massive marble kitchen island, the exact surface where I had spent countless evenings cooking dinners for a man who had been quietly, methodically plotting my complete financial destruction the entire time. I pulled a sheet of thick, cream-colored stationery from the side drawer and uncapped a black ink pen. A screaming match would have given them the satisfaction of watching me react. Silence paired with total, irreversible financial annihilation was considerably more my style. I kept my handwriting fluid and unhurried, crafting a message so perfectly calibrated in its false sweetness that it was practically venomous to the touch. Good morning, Brandon. I realized last night that you and your mother truly need this house far more than I do. I want you both to be completely comfortable here. Please keep the master bedroom. Make yourselves entirely at home. Everything inside the master wall safe is my early wedding gift to you and Brenda. Enjoy your new life together. I am heading to the spa to get ready for our big weekend. Love, Allison. I folded the note in precise halves and placed it exactly in the center of the kitchen island, directly beside the espresso machine, the first place Brandon's eyes would land the moment he wandered downstairs. Inside the master wall safe, I had arranged the final components of the package with careful deliberation: a copy of the canceled wedding venue contract, the severed credit card statements with the federal identity theft stamps Harrison had applied across every single page, and the official, notarized corporate eviction notice from Titan Property Management, printed on the most authoritative letterhead Harrison's office possessed. I picked up my briefcase, walked to the front door, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. I locked it securely behind me without a moment's hesitation, climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the estate without once looking back. Let them wake up. Let them celebrate their imaginary victory over their morning coffee. By noon, the sound of approaching police sirens would provide the perfect fitting soundtrack to their spectacular and total destruction. I settled into the plush leather chair of a private suite at a downtown luxury spa, a freshly brewed espresso warming my hand. My tablet was propped on the glass side table in front of me, streaming crisp, high-definition footage from the concealed security cameras installed throughout my estate months before I ever met Brandon. As a forensic auditor who spent her career uncovering what people tried to hide, I had never trusted anyone without reservation. Trust is a liability. Surveillance is an asset. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the kitchen camera feed showed Brandon sauntering in from the staircase. He was wearing his expensive silk robe, one hand casually running through his perfectly styled hair. He moved with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him. He crossed to the espresso machine and immediately spotted the cream-colored stationery centered on the marble island. I watched his eyes move across the words I had written. His existing smirk expanded slowly into a full, triumphant grin. He actually pumped his fist in the air. He genuinely believed he had won. In his mind, my quiet departure to the spa was the ultimate act of submission. Proof that the wealthy, independent woman had finally located her proper place in the hierarchy he had constructed entirely in his own imagination. He snatched the note off the counter and practically sprinted back up the stairs. I switched my view to the master bedroom feed. Brenda was propped against my custom-upholstered headboard, wearing one of my silk sleeping masks pushed up on her forehead like a crown, a cup of tea balanced in her hand. She was scanning the walls of my bedroom with the unhurried, proprietary gaze of someone already mentally redecorating. Brandon burst through the door, waving the note above his head like a lottery ticket he'd already confirmed was worth millions. "Mom, look at this." His voice came through the audio feed loud and bright with self-congratulation. "I told you she would cave. I told you I had her completely wrapped around my finger. She left for the spa to get ready for the wedding. She said we can have the master bedroom permanently." Brenda accepted the note, her eyes moving quickly across my handwriting. A wicked, deeply satisfied laugh erupted from her throat. "I knew it," she crowed, dropping the note carelessly onto my nightstand. "These career women always talk such a big game, but at the end of the day they are desperate to keep a handsome man. She knows her biological clock is ticking, Brandon. She knows she needs you far more than you need her." She spread her hands wide with grand, theatrical satisfaction. "We are going to be living in absolute luxury. We have just secured our entire retirement plan." "Read the last part, Mom," Brandon said, pointing eagerly at the bottom of the page. "She left us an early wedding gift inside the wall safe. She is practically handing over the keys to the kingdom to make up for being such a nightmare last night." Brenda moved out of that bed with a speed that genuinely surprised me. She crossed the room rapidly, heading directly for the discreet recessed paneling behind the closet door, where the wall safe sat flush with the wall. "Open it!" she demanded, tapping Brandon sharply on the shoulder. "Hurry up! She probably left cash, or those bearer bonds she is always bragging about auditing. Maybe she finally put your name on the property deed." Brandon stepped up to the keypad. He entered the 6-digit code with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was being clever. He had memorized it 2 months ago by leaning over my shoulder while I opened it. A small act of covert observation he was clearly quite proud of. I had allowed him to see it on purpose, with full patience and full intent. A rat will always return to the cheese, and I had made certain the cheese was exactly where he expected it to be. The heavy steel door beeped once and swung open with a soft, mechanical click. I leaned forward slightly in my spa chair and zoomed in on the camera feed, lifting my espresso cup to my lips. The payoff was going to be exquisite. Brandon reached into the dark interior of the safe. There were no neat stacks of $100 bills. There were no velvet jewelry cases. There was only a single thick manila envelope, sealed and centered precisely. He pulled it out, his expression already shifting from triumphant to uncertain. He tore the top open and upended the contents onto the pristine white duvet of my bed. Brenda leaned in immediately, her eyes wide with anticipation, fully expecting to find financial salvation spilling across the fabric. Instead, she found a stack of heavily stamped, formally notarized legal documents. Brandon lifted the first page. It bore the official letterhead of our exclusive wedding venue, the name embossed in deep gold at the top. His eyes moved across the bold text, and the smug color drained from his face so completely and so rapidly that I watched it happen in real time on the camera feed. "What is it?" Brenda demanded, snatching the paper from his suddenly unsteady hand. "It is a cancellation notice," Brandon whispered, his voice reduced to something hollow and very small. "She canceled the venue. She canceled the caterer. She canceled the entire wedding. There is a zero refund attached." Brenda stared at the document with her mouth open. "That is impossible. The rehearsal is tonight. You cannot simply cancel a $100,000 wedding." Brandon did not respond. He was already reaching for the second stack of papers. The complete statements for both platinum credit cards fraudulently opened against my social security number. Across the top of every single page, Harrison had applied a large, unambiguous red stamp. "Federal identity theft reported. Accounts frozen. Investigation pending." Brandon dropped the papers as though the ink itself had burned his fingers. He stumbled backward into the closet door, his hands immediately going to his pockets, pulling out his cell phone to open his banking application. I watched the precise moment his screen loaded. I watched his eyes lock onto the balance. $800. Exactly what he had contributed. Not a cent more. He understood in that instant that the unlimited well had run completely and permanently dry. Brenda was moving through the remaining pages on the bed, her hands trembling with increasing violence. She reached the final document. The formal, notarized corporate eviction notice, printed on Harrison's most authoritative, firm letterhead. "Brandon!" she shrieked, her voice climbing into a register I had not heard from a human adult in years. "What is Titan Property Management? Why does this document say Titan Property Management owns this house?" Brandon stared at her, his breathing becoming rapid and audibly shallow. "What are you talking about? Allison owns this house." "Not anymore!" Brenda yelled, pressing the legal notice hard against his chest. "It says the property was transferred. It says your residency is officially and immediately terminated." Brandon seized the document and read the final paragraph aloud, his voice fracturing completely on every third word. "Hostile trespassers must vacate the commercial premises immediately. Local law enforcement has been dispatched to execute a forced removal at exactly 11:59 this morning. Any personal belongings remaining inside the property after 12 noon will be considered voluntarily abandoned and disposed of accordingly." He looked up at the wall clock. 10:30. They had less than 90 minutes before the sheriff's deputies arrived at the front door. "She knew," Brandon gasped, one hand moving to his chest as the full weight of it descended on him all at once. "She knew about the credit cards. She knew about your gambling debts. She set the entire thing up. We have no money. We have no house. The federal fraud investigators are going to come for me for identity theft. We have absolutely nothing, Mom." Brenda collapsed onto the edge of the bed, both hands pulling at her hair. "This cannot be happening. Call her. Call her right now and fix this. Beg her. Tell her you will do anything she wants. Anything at all." Brandon dialed my number with frantic, shaking fingers. I watched him pace the length of the bedroom, pressing the phone to his ear, his face twisted into an expression of pure, unfiltered desperation. On the glass table beside my espresso cup, my private phone sat in complete, unbothered silence. I had routed his number to a disconnected tone the previous evening. I watched him pull the phone away from his ear and stare at the screen as the automated message informed him, with perfect indifference, that the number he was attempting to reach was no longer in service. Every last pillar of their elaborate, carefully constructed illusion had collapsed simultaneously. They were standing inside a fortress that had transformed overnight into a locked cage, and the clock on the wall was ticking toward noon with complete and total indifference to their panic. I took one final, deeply satisfying sip of my espresso and closed the camera application. It was time for law enforcement to take over. I had done my part. I told myself I would stop watching. I settled back into the heated massage chair, wrapped in a thick spa robe, and lasted approximately 45 seconds before reopening the security application on my tablet. Missing the finale of a trap I had spent an entire sleepless night engineering with such exacting care was simply not something I was prepared to do. The digital clock in the corner of my screen moved steadily, inevitably toward noon. It was exactly 24 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle of a flower-lined venue in a dress that had cost more than most people's cars. Instead of standing at an altar, I was about to watch my former fiancé discover what a pair of silver handcuffs felt like against his wrists. Inside the house, complete chaos had taken over every room simultaneously. The camera feeds showed Brandon moving rapidly through the downstairs in a state of escalating, barely contained terror, his phone pressed permanently to his ear. He was calling every defense attorney his frantic Google search could locate, pacing the living room in tight, anxious circles, running his free hand repeatedly through his now considerably less perfect hair. I did not need audio to reconstruct the conversation on the other end of each call. Every firm in Chicago would be requesting a substantial retainer up front, money he did not have, would not have, and could not borrow. His $800 bank balance could not purchase a consultation, let alone a defense. Upstairs, Brenda had descended into complete, unguarded collapse. She was packing her cheap porcelain figurines and loud summer dresses back into the same cardboard boxes she had unpacked with such triumphant ceremony just hours ago, weeping openly, her face blotched and her hands unsteady, confronting the full reality that the luxurious retirement she had gambled everything to secure had dissolved completely into the air around her. At precisely 12 o'clock noon, a formation of vehicles turned into my driveway with unhurried institutional authority. Through the exterior camera, I watched two marked county sheriff's cruisers and a large unmarked cargo van park in a deliberate line along the curb. 4 uniformed deputies stepped out onto the pavement, led by a composed, experienced county sheriff carrying a thick official clipboard under one arm. The knock on my custom mahogany front door that followed was not a polite inquiry. It was the deep, resonant, entirely unmistakable sound of law enforcement executing a corporate directive, heavy, authoritative, and absolutely final. Brandon froze in the center of the living room. He stared at the front door as though it were a live explosive device counting down its final seconds. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, straightened the collar of his designer shirt with practiced composure, and marched toward the entryway with the manufactured confidence of a man who had talked his way out of difficult situations before and fully expected to do so again. He pulled the door open and deployed the same smooth, charming, well-practiced salesman smile he used on reluctant clients. "Officers, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calibrated to project easy authority. "I am the homeowner's fiancé. We are simply dealing with a minor misunderstanding this morning. I am sure we can clear this up quickly." The sheriff did not return the smile. He did not on someone's part. "I can have it sorted out with one phone call." The sheriff raised the clipboard without comment, displaying the thick, formally executed stack of legal documents that Harrison had expedited through the county court system in the pre-dawn hours. His expression did not shift by a single degree. "There is no clerical error. This property is exclusively owned by Titan Property Management. Titan Property Management holds no residential leases and has entered into no occupancy agreements of any kind. You are currently occupying a commercial asset without authorization or legal basis. You have been formally served with a notice of immediate termination of residency. Step outside the property right now." Brandon's carefully constructed smile collapsed all at once, falling away like a facade with nothing left behind it. Every trace of color evacuated his face as the clean, indifferent machinery of corporate law reduced his entire argument to rubble in 4 sentences. "Officer, you do not understand the situation," he stammered, taking an involuntary step backward into the foyer. "My fiancé is upset with me. She is playing a game. She does this when she is angry. You cannot remove us. We live here. We have established residency. This is a personal dispute between 2 people who are getting married tomorrow. You are trespassing on private corporate property," the sheriff repeated, his tone carrying precisely 0 room for further discussion. "Step outside the residence immediately, or you will be physically removed from the premises." The sound of rapid footsteps on the staircase cut through the air before Brandon could respond. Brenda stormed into the foyer with the righteous, unstoppable energy of a woman who had never once in her life been told that the rules applied to her personally. She thrust a trembling finger directly at the sheriff, her face contorted into a mask of pure, incandescent entitlement. "You cannot do this to us!" she shrieked, her voice reaching a frequency that probably disturbed the neighbors 2 houses down. "My son is going to own this property by tomorrow afternoon. We are moving in permanently, and there is nothing you can do about it. You have no right to come to this address and threaten my family. I am a senior citizen, and I know my rights." "Ma'am," the sheriff said, stepping calmly across the threshold into the foyer, one hand resting with relaxed authority on his utility belt. "I am informing you for the final time. Vacate the premises immediately." "I am not going anywhere!" Brenda screamed, planting both feet wide on my hardwood floor and crossing her arms across her chest with the absolute conviction of someone who had never encountered a consequence she could not cry or shout her way out of. "This is my house now. My son's name is going on this deed. We are not leaving." That was the precise moment the deputies moved. They did not argue with her. They did not attempt to reason with the delusion. 2 officers stepped past Brandon in unison, each taking one of Brenda's arms with practiced efficiency. She shrieked and began thrashing immediately, wrenching her body sideways, kicking out at the officers with both feet, her sense of entitlement so absolute and so total that it had apparently blinded her entirely to the severe legal consequences of physically assaulting law enforcement officers inside a property she had no legal claim to whatsoever. Within seconds, a sharp, clean metallic click cut through her shrieking. The deputies pinned her arms behind her back and secured a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists, with calm, mechanical precision. "Get your hands off my mother," Brandon bellowed, lurching forward. It was the single most catastrophically stupid decision he could have made in that moment. The 2 remaining deputies moved instantly. They grabbed Brandon and drove him hard into the wall of the entryway. He grunted audibly as his shoulder connected with the expensive wallpaper he had never contributed a single dollar toward. They twisted his arms back with practiced efficiency, and the second metallic click of the morning rang out through my foyer. The slick, self-appointed man of the house, the regional sales director who had stood in my hallway less than 12 hours ago and lectured me about partnerships and teams, was now fully restrained, his face pressed against the floral wallpaper, his designer collar crumpled against the baseboard. I watched through my tablet screen as the deputies walked them out through the front door and down the porch steps in the pale noon light. I switched to the exterior camera feed to capture the full scope of what was unfolding. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers had already drawn a substantial audience. My neighborhood was populated with affluent, highly attentive residents who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Neighbors had gathered on their manicured front lawns, holding leashed golden retrievers, cradling coffee cups, shielding their eyes against the sun, watching with wide, unblinking attention as Brandon and Brenda were walked down the driveway in restraints like any other pair of people who had made the serious error of treating someone else's property as their own. The humiliation was absolute, complete, and entirely, irreversibly public. Brandon had dropped his head toward his chest, angling his face away from the watching crowd, with the desperate energy of a man who understood that his professional reputation in this city was evaporating in real time with every step he took down that driveway. Brenda, characteristically, was still screaming. She was shouting my name to anyone within earshot, cursing with impressive creativity, her voice carrying all the way to the end of the block, systematically dismantling whatever fractional remnant of dignity she had managed to preserve up to that point. But the architecture of this particular reckoning was not yet finished. The unmarked cargo van that had arrived alongside the police cruisers swung its rear doors open with a heavy clang. 6 broad-shouldered men in matching company work uniforms stepped out onto the pavement. This was the rapid property clean-out crew Harrison had contracted on behalf of Titan Property Management, professionals hired specifically to execute the physical component of corporate evictions efficiently and without sentiment. The sheriff gave them a single nod. The crew walked straight through my front door and up the staircase to the master bedroom without hesitation or ceremony. I watched through the camera feed in a state of deep, unhurried satisfaction as they began moving Brenda's cardboard boxes toward the exit. They did not handle the contents with particular care. They did not pause to stack or sort. Operating strictly within the legal parameters governing the disposal of abandoned property during a hostile corporate eviction, the crew transported every box, bag, and loose item to the outermost edge of the property line and deposited them on the public sidewalk curb without ceremony or apology. Then came Brandon's possessions, his expensive designer suits in their dry cleaning bags, his golf clubs in their premium carry case, his collection of imported luxury watches, each one purchased with money he did not have to maintain a persona he had not earned. The crew hauled each item out of my house and dropped it onto the pavement directly beside Brenda's cheap porcelain figurines and her garish summer wardrobe. It was the precise, poetic mirror image of what Brenda had done to my designer bags less than 24 hours earlier. The moment she had so proudly stacked them in the hallway as a statement of territorial conquest. Only now, their belongings were not resting in a climate-controlled entryway. They were piled in a heap on a public sidewalk in a wealthy neighborhood, fully visible to every single person who lived within a 3-block radius. The deputies secured Brandon and Brenda in the back seats of the 2 marked cruisers. Through the exterior camera, I watched Brandon stare out through the barred rear window, his eyes moving across the concrete where the scattered remnants of his carefully fabricated life lay in a pile. The full comprehension of his absolute self-authored ruin was permanently written across his face in an expression that no amount of charm or smooth talking would ever be able to undo. The cruisers pulled away from the curb with their sirens active, carrying my former fiancé and his mother directly to the county jail for processing. The clean-out crew locked my front door with quiet efficiency, handed the keys to the sheriff, and drove away. The street in front of my estate was left with nothing but a heap of discarded belongings on the curb, the physical residue of 2 people who had looked at everything I had built and decided it belonged to them. I locked the screen of my tablet, set it on the side table, and leaned back slowly into the massage chair. I took one long, clean breath. My house was restored. My assets were sealed and secured. The parasites had been successfully and completely extracted. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a genuine, unhurried smile. It was turning out to be a truly beautiful weekend. By late afternoon, the county jail had processed and released both Brandon and Brenda on bail. I was aware of this because I had established automated alerts linked to their individual booking numbers through the county inmate registry the previous evening, a minor precaution that required no effort and cost me nothing. Vanessa, the devoted daughter and sister, had driven to the facility to post their release. I imagined them retreating together to some budget motel on the outskirts of the city to conduct a quiet, humiliated post-mortem on everything that had gone catastrophically wrong. I should have known, with everything I already understood about their character, that parasites do not retreat gracefully when their food source is cut off. When genuine desperation sets in, they do not accept defeat. They become dangerous in smaller, pettier, more vindictive ways. I was sitting at my desk in my newly re-secured home office the following morning, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee at my elbow, when my customized media monitoring software began to chime with soft, insistent alerts. In my professional world, reputation is not merely important, it is the entire foundation. A financial forensic auditor is only as valuable as the integrity of her name. Corporations retain me to locate missing millions and expose sophisticated fraud precisely because my ethical standing is considered bulletproof and my record is without stain. I maintained proprietary algorithms running continuously across the internet, scanning in real time for any mention of my name, my firm's name, or any of my registered corporate shell entities. If my name appeared anywhere online, in any context, at any volume, I received an immediate notification. The alerts were chiming because someone was talking about me. Without warning, the dashboard erupted in a cascade of red alerts. Notifications flooded in simultaneously from Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, each one pinging louder than the last. I clicked through to the primary source link with a cold, deliberate calm. It traced back to a public post originating from Vanessa's account. And it was already spreading like wildfire through our extended social circles and the tight-knit local Chicago community groups we both inhabited. Brandon had clearly been the architect behind every calculated word. He had helped her craft it with surgical precision, aiming directly for maximum emotional manipulation and the complete obliteration of my professional standing. The post featured a heavily edited, tearful video of Brenda perched on a sagging motel bed, deliberately styled to appear disheveled and physically frail. Positioned above the video was an enormous block of text. "Let the world know the truth about Allison," the post announced with theatrical gravity. "She is a clinical psychopath who preys on loving families. For 2 years, she manipulated my brother Brandon, systematically draining our family finances to fund her sham accounting business. Yesterday, on the very eve of their wedding, she illegally threw my elderly mother onto the street and stole every single dime we had." I scoffed at the breathtaking projection of it all. They were literally accusing me of the exact crimes they themselves had methodically committed. But the post did not stop there. It pivoted into territory that was far darker, genuinely vile, and unmistakably deliberate. "The real reason she canceled the wedding," Vanessa had written, flanking the line with rows of red alarm emojis, "is because she has been carrying on a disgusting secret affair with my husband, Terrence. Allison and Terrence have been conspiring behind our backs for months. He abandoned his own child yesterday to run off with this rich, manipulative woman. We welcomed Terrence into our home with open arms, and he repaid our generosity by teaming up with this fraud to systematically destroy us." I read the words a second time, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. The racist undertones were not even remotely subtle. They were deliberate, weaponized, and constructed with hateful intent. They were painting Terrence, a hard-working, intellectually brilliant African-American man, as the treacherous, fundamentally untrustworthy outsider who had infiltrated their pure, innocent family unit to plunder their wealth. They framed him as a morally compromised predator who had been effortlessly purchased by a wealthy, psychotic woman. It was a disgusting, meticulously calculated smear campaign designed to ignite public outrage and systematically dismantle both of our lives from the inside out. But Brandon was not satisfied with mere social media sympathy. He was actively, aggressively targeting my livelihood. He had taken Vanessa's post and reshared it across LinkedIn, deliberately and maliciously tagging the chief executive officers of my 3 largest and most valuable corporate clients. "Do not trust your corporate audits to a woman currently under investigation for financial fraud and elder abuse," Brandon had commented beneath his shared post. Allison uses her firm as a vehicle to launder stolen family money. Protect your shareholders before it is too late. This was no longer just a desperate tantrum. This was a targeted, premeditated campaign of corporate defamation executed with strategic intent. In the financial sector, even the faintest whisper of fraud is sufficient to trigger an institutional panic. If a multinational corporation comes to believe that their independent auditor is in any way compromised, they will sever contracts immediately and without hesitation in order to protect their own share prices and board reputations. Brandon understood this dynamic perfectly. He was attempting to hold my entire career hostage, gambling that I would panic, abandon the eviction proceedings, and pay them off handsomely in exchange for the posts being quietly deleted. My private phone vibrated sharply against the desk surface. It was Terrence. I answered without a moment's hesitation. "Tell me you are seeing this absolute garbage," Terrence said, his voice a low, controlled, dangerous rumble barely containing its fury. "Vanessa is completely out of her mind. She is telling everyone I abandoned my son. She knows perfectly well that my son is staying with my mother this entire weekend while I sort through the divorce paperwork. And the way she is portraying me and you together, it is genuinely sickening." "I am seeing every word of it, Terrence," I replied, my voice steady and deliberately cold. "They are trying to burn us both to the ground simultaneously. Brandon is actively tagging my corporate clients on LinkedIn. They want us on our knees, begging for mercy." "I am a certified public accountant," Terrence said, his anger radiating palpably through the speaker. "If my licensing board sees these accusations of me conspiring to commit financial fraud, they could suspend my license pending a full formal investigation. This is my entire career, Allison. This is how I provide for my son. We absolutely cannot sit back and allow them to control this narrative." "We are not going to let them spin a single thing," I assured him, my tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "They believe the internet is an unstoppable weapon. What they have conveniently forgotten is that I command the digital landscape professionally, for a living. I need you to stay precisely where you are right now. Do not reply to any of her posts. Do not send her a single text message. Do not engage in any form. Any communication you make in this moment will be deliberately twisted and weaponized as fuel for their carefully constructed fake victim narrative. Let them keep posting. Let them keep enthusiastically digging their own legal graves." "What exactly is your plan?" Terrence asked, drawing a slow, deep breath to steady himself. "I am calling Harrison right now," I stated flatly. "Brandon just upgraded his criminal exposure from identity theft to gross corporate defamation, libel, and tortious interference with a business contract. Every single tag on LinkedIn is another nail being hammered into his own coffin." I ended the call with Terrence and immediately speed-dialed my attorney. Harrison answered with his characteristic brisk, no-nonsense efficiency. "Tell me you have already secured the screenshots," Harrison said before I could even offer a greeting. "I have the screenshots, the full IP logs, the timestamps, and a complete archived record of every corporate client they tagged," I confirmed without pause. "Brandon is attempting to leverage my professional reputation to strong-arm me into a settlement." Harrison let out a sharp, predatory laugh that carried genuine satisfaction in it. "Excellent. Tortious interference is my absolute favorite legal playground. We are drafting a cease and desist order this very moment, but we are not going to deliver it quietly through a back channel. We are going to attach it directly to a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit filed in open court. I need you to prepare a comprehensive digital evidence packet immediately." "I am already compiling it as we speak," I replied, my fingers moving with practiced speed across the keyboard. "But Harrison, they are cornered and desperate. This internet smear campaign is only the opening salvo. The moment they realize I am not picking up the phone to beg for a truce, they are going to escalate significantly. Brandon is reckless by nature and his mother is absolutely furious. Neither of them will stay hiding behind a keyboard for long. You genuinely believe they are going to show up in person? Harrison asked, his tone shifting immediately to measured legal caution. I know with complete certainty that they will, I said. Brandon is a textbook narcissist who has always relied on physical intimidation and theatrical, explosive arguments to dominate situations. He craves an audience. He will want to manufacture a scene in the location where he believes I am most publicly exposed and most professionally vulnerable. He will come directly to my corporate headquarters. Then we will be fully prepared and waiting for him. Harrison replied without missing a beat, his voice smooth with quiet confidence. I am walking out of my office right now. I will meet you in the lobby of your corporate building in 30 minutes. Bring the restraining orders. Bring every piece of fraud evidence we have assembled. Let the man walk himself directly into the trap we have set. I ended the call. A sharp, cold smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. Brandon genuinely believed he could dismantle my reputation by staging a public meltdown across social media platforms. He was about to receive a very thorough education in what happens when you attempt to bring a social media post to a federal corporate knife fight. I collected my briefcase, secured my home office, and walked out the front door with purpose. The real performance was about to begin. The drive to my corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago took exactly 45 minutes. I used every one of those minutes to execute a deliberate, precise transition in my mindset. From a homeowner who had successfully defended her personal sanctuary to a chief executive officer now mobilizing to protect her empire. My firm occupied the uppermost 3 floors of a sleek, immaculately maintained glass and steel high-rise that commanded the surrounding skyline. The lobby was a sweeping expanse of polished white marble, floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light, and a state-of-the-art security checkpoint that left absolutely nothing to chance. The entire space had been designed with one conscious purpose: to make anyone who stepped through those revolving glass doors feel the full psychological weight of institutional power. I bypassed my private executive parking elevator entirely and entered deliberately through the main public entrance, where I could be seen. Harrison was already stationed near the reception desk when I arrived, impeccably composed. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit that looked as though it had been pressed 20 minutes ago and carried a thick leather briefcase that I knew from experience contained enough concentrated legal firepower to dismantle multiple careers and several carefully constructed lies. I approached the head of building security, a decorated retired military veteran who managed my facility with the kind of exacting, uncompromising precision that I deeply respected. I issued him a very specific, carefully worded directive. I informed him that 3 highly agitated individuals were likely to breach the front entrance within the hour. I instructed him explicitly not to impede their entry into the lobby, but to immediately lock down every single elevator bank and all stairwell access points the moment they stepped inside. I needed them contained within the wide-open, fully exposed public space, perfectly visible to the high-definition security cameras mounted at every corner and angle of the room. Harrison and I positioned ourselves near the center of the lobby and reviewed the drafted cease and desist orders with deliberate, unhurried calm. The morning flow of employees and visiting corporate clients moved naturally around us on all sides. It was, I thought with grim satisfaction, the perfect stage for a man who desperately craved a captive audience. We did not have to exercise patience for long. Through the vast glass walls of the building, I watched a visibly dented sedan screech to a jarring halt in the restricted loading zone outside. The doors flew open with violent energy. Brandon emerged first, his face flushed a deep manic red, radiating the kind of desperate, unhinged fury that accompanies a man who has already lost and simply hasn't acknowledged it yet. Moving closely behind him was Vanessa, her smartphone raised conspicuously above her shoulder, live recording the entire theatrical approach for her fabricated social media audience. Bringing up the rear was Brenda, looking utterly stripped of the polished suburban elegance she had carefully cultivated for decades. Her hair had collapsed into a disheveled tangle, and her clothing was visibly wrinkled from her brief but deeply unpleasant involuntary stay in the county holding facility. The automatic glass doors parted, and all three of them stormed into my professional domain, hauling the chaotic, corrosive energy of a daytime tabloid program directly into the most formal space I owned. "Allison!" Brandon roared, his voice detonating off the marble walls and ricocheting through the entire lobby. The room came to a sudden collective standstill. Employees froze with their coffee cups suspended halfway to their lips. Visiting executives pivoted in place, their expressions shifting from polite distraction to sharp, uncomfortable confusion. The security team stepped immediately forward, hands resting on their radios, but held their positions with disciplined restraint exactly as I had directed. I did not flinch. I did not retreat a single step. I stood my ground with both feet planted firmly on the marble floor, my hands folded neatly and deliberately in front of me, projecting an aura of absolute freezing composure. Harrison held his position solidly at my right side, his expression a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. Brandon advanced toward me with aggressive purpose, stopping just a few feet from my face, close enough to make the physical intimidation unmistakably intentional. He wanted to overwhelm me with his proximity, his volume, and his manufactured outrage. Vanessa materialized directly behind his shoulder, the camera lens of her phone angled without subtlety straight at my face. "I want every single person in this building to see exactly who they are working for," Brandon shouted, pivoting theatrically to address the growing crowd of transfixed onlookers. "Your boss is a fraud. She is a psychotic, manipulative criminal who steals from the people closest to her. She illegally threw my elderly mother out onto the street just yesterday. She has systematically destroyed my life, and she is actively laundering stolen money through the very company you all walk into every single morning." Brenda jabbed a trembling, accusatory finger in my direction, layering her shrill voice over his. "She belongs in an institution. She is a monster, a genuine, dangerous monster." I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with Brandon throughout the entire spectacle. I did not elevate my voice a single decibel to compete with his frantic shouting. When I spoke, I used a quiet, precisely calibrated authority that cut through the silence of the lobby like a blade. "You are trespassing on private commercial property, Brandon. You have exactly 60 seconds to state the legitimate purpose of your visit before my security team physically removes you from these premises and places you under arrest for criminal public disturbance." Brandon released a harsh, barking laugh that bounced off the marble ceiling. He had interpreted my measured calm as an unmistakable sign of fear. He was certain my composed exterior concealed pure terror at the prospect of public exposure. He reached deliberately into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced his ultimate weapon. He held up a sleek silver USB flash drive, pinching it between his thumb and forefinger and elevating it high above his head, displaying it to me and to every witness in the lobby with the theatrical triumph of a gladiator presenting a severed head to a roaring coliseum. "I don't think you're going to be calling anyone, Allison," Brandon sneered, his eyes igniting with malicious, self-congratulatory triumph. "Because you and I both know with complete certainty exactly what I am holding right here." I stared at the small silver drive. It was the identical piece of bait I had placed with careful deliberateness in the precise center of my mahogany desk at 2:30 in the morning. He had taken it. He had actually broken into my private home office during his panicked, frantic scramble in the hours before the sheriff arrived, and he had walked directly into the trap I had constructed and laid specifically for him. "When you left the house yesterday morning," Brandon said, his voice dripping with arrogant, performative confidence, "you neglected to properly lock your precious little office. I went inside to retrieve my personal belongings and I found this sitting right there in plain sight on your desk. I plugged it into my laptop, Allison. I downloaded absolutely everything on it. I have your complete corporate client registry. I have the confidential financial audits you conduct on those major banking institutions. I have every single carefully guarded secret buried inside those encrypted files." Harrison shifted almost imperceptibly beside me. I could sense the deep, controlled satisfaction radiating quietly from my attorney. But neither of us broke character for even a fraction of a second. "Are you threatening me, Brandon?" I asked softly, ensuring my voice was captured with perfect clarity by the overhead security microphones and the live feed streaming from Vanessa's phone. "I am giving you a business proposal," Brandon shouted back, advancing one deliberate pace closer, closing the distance between us with practiced aggression. "You think you can freeze my bank accounts? You think you can publicly humiliate my mother and walk away clean? Well, now I hold the keys to your entire empire. If this data gets leaked to the right people, your firm is finished. Your clients will sue you into absolute oblivion. You will be disbarred, disgraced, and left completely bankrupt with nothing." "State your terms," I said, keeping my face perfectly, professionally blank. Brandon smiled, a grotesque, greedy contortion of his features that made him look like exactly what he was. "I want $500,000 wired into a secure offshore account by the close of business today, and I want the deed to the Chicago estate transferred solely and permanently into my name. You give me the cash and the house, and I hand over the drive. If you refuse, or if you make any attempt to involve law enforcement, I walk out those doors and I sell this entire database to your biggest and most ruthless corporate competitors. They will pay millions for the forensic secrets you have buried in those encrypted files." Vanessa stepped up tightly beside him, thrusting her phone closer to my face with barely contained excitement. "You heard him clearly, Allison. Pay up or we ruin you completely. We are not leaving this building until we receive exactly what we deserve." I looked at Brandon, then at Vanessa, and finally at Brenda, who was nodding with vigorous, unambiguous enthusiasm at what amounted to a massive and explicit criminal conspiracy. They had just walked into the lobby of a major financial institution, surrounded by high-definition security cameras recording from every angle and dozens of wide-eyed professional witnesses, and had committed federal extortion, corporate blackmail, and grand larceny in a single, uninterrupted performance. I looked back at the silver USB drive gleaming triumphantly between Brandon's fingers. He believed with complete conviction that he was holding a nuclear device capable of obliterating my entire life. He had absolutely no idea that what he was actually holding was the pin to a hand grenade, and that he had already pulled it. I did not gasp. I did not beg. I did not plead. Instead, a sound escaped my lips that completely and visibly derailed Brandon's triumphant moment. I laughed. It was not a nervous, uncertain chuckle. It was a full, resonant, chest-deep laugh that rolled across the polished marble lobby and bounced off the high ceilings with crystalline clarity. The security guards exchanged genuinely confused glances. The corporate executives who had paused their morning routines to observe the unfolding spectacle leaned slightly forward. Brandon lowered the silver flash drive a fractional inch, his brow creasing in sudden deep confusion. Vanessa lowered her phone by degrees, her carefully constructed victim narrative stumbling visibly against my authentic, unhurried amusement. Brenda glared at me with undisguised fury, her face cycling toward a violent shade of purple. "Are you completely insane?" Brandon demanded, his voice cracking slightly under the mounting pressure of my reaction. I just told you I have your entire corporate client registry. I have the files that will put you in a federal prison. I hold your entire life and everything you have ever built in the palm of my hand. I stopped laughing. I let the silence expand and stretch for one long, agonizing second. Then I took a slow, measured step forward, my heels clicking sharply and deliberately against the polished stone floor. Harrison moved smoothly into position at my side, reaching into his thick leather briefcase with practiced efficiency. He withdrew a substantial stack of legal documents bound firmly by a heavy blue clip and extended his arm, slapping the papers directly against Brandon's chest with a forceful, resonant thud. Brandon reflexively grabbed the stack, clutching it instinctively alongside the silver USB drive. "What you are holding in your hands right now," Harrison announced, his voice projecting with the measured, commanding authority of a man who had delivered verdicts in courtrooms for 30 years, "are formal restraining orders filed and approved in the state of Illinois, legally prohibiting you, your mother, and your sister from coming within 500 feet of my client or any of her registered business properties. Furthermore, you have just been formally served with federal civil summons encompassing charges of identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny." Brandon sneered, waving the legal papers dismissively as though they were junk mail. "You think a restraining order frightens me? I have the leverage. I have the data. You are going to drop every one of those lawsuits, or I am hitting send on these files right now." I crossed my arms and met Brandon's eyes with absolute stillness. "Prove it." Brandon blinked. "Excuse me?" "Prove it," I repeated, my voice ringing through the lobby with a cold, chilling clarity that left no room for ambiguity. "You are standing in the lobby of my company, surrounded by my employees and recorded by my cameras, claiming to possess my most sensitive and confidential financial forensic data. If you intend to extort me for $500,000 and a multi-million-dollar estate, you are going to need to show me the merchandise. Prove to me, right here and right now, that you actually managed to bypass my military-grade encryption. Pull out your laptop, plug that drive in, and show me the files." Vanessa shoved her phone back directly into Brandon's field of vision. "Do it, Brandon," she urged, her voice pitched high and brittle with greedy anticipation. "Show everyone what a fraud she really is. Expose her right here in front of all of them." Brandon hesitated. I could see the gears turning visibly beneath the surface of his expression. He was, at his core, a salesman, a man who operated on bluff, on fast talk, and on the psychological leverage of physical intimidation. But his ego was far too inflated and far too fragile to back down publicly, especially with his sister broadcasting the entire confrontation in real time to her social media followers. He unzipped the leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder and produced his sleek silver work laptop, the expensive corporate machine provided by his employer, the one he used daily to connect to his company's sales network. He flipped it open and balanced it carefully on his forearm. The screen illuminated to life. He looked at me with an expression of absolute sneering triumph. "You asked for this, Allison. Say a proper goodbye to your empire." He took the silver USB flash drive and drove it firmly into the port on the side of his laptop. I watched the small LED indicator light on the drive begin to blink in rapid, rhythmic pulses. I did not blink. I did not look away. I watched the exact, precise moment his entire existence shattered into a million irrecoverable fragments. Brandon tapped his trackpad expectantly, waiting for the File Explorer window to appear and display my supposedly stolen secrets laid out before him. Instead, his computer screen convulsed with a violent flicker. The bright, familiar desktop background vanished entirely, replaced by a solid, impenetrable pitch-black screen. A split second later, a massive, glaring red warning banner detonated across the display. A cascading string of complex, rapidly scrolling alphanumeric code poured down the monitor in an unbroken torrent. "What the hell is this?" Brandon muttered, hammering the keys in mounting, frantic confusion. "The computer is completely freezing up." I drew a slow, deliberate breath, allowing the clean, pure taste of absolute victory to settle fully into my lungs. "Did you honestly believe that stealing data from a financial forensics expert was going to be that straightforward, Brandon?" I asked, my voice slicing through his rapidly escalating panic with the precision of a surgical blade. "Did you genuinely think that a man who cannot file his own basic tax returns without my personal assistance could somehow breach a biometric, multi-tiered, encrypted security network?" Brandon slammed his finger against the power button repeatedly, but the machine was entirely, completely unresponsive. The red banner on the screen began to pulse with a slow, ominous rhythm. "You did not steal my client data," I explained, stepping forward so that he could hear every single syllable with unmistakable clarity. "You stole a quarantined piece of bait. That silver USB drive you lifted from my mahogany desk contains a highly aggressive military-grade ransomware payload, a virus engineered specifically to probe and expose corporate network vulnerabilities, and you just personally unleashed it." Brenda gasped, seizing Brandon's arm. "What does she mean? Brandon, what did you do?" I did not allow him to answer. "The moment you inserted that drive into your laptop, the payload executed automatically and completely," I continued, my tone relentless and methodical. "And because you are operating on your corporate machine, which connects automatically to your employer's virtual private network the instant you power it on, the virus did not simply lock your laptop. It immediately propagated through your VPN connection and infected your company's entire corporate network infrastructure." Brandon stared at me, his mouth opened and closed in perfect horrified silence. The color drained from his face in a single, visible wave, leaving him looking like a ghost of the arrogant man who had stormed through my revolving doors 20 minutes earlier. "You just deployed a devastating ransomware attack directly into the primary servers of the company where you hold the title of Regional Sales Director," I stated, making certain that every lobby camera captured his complete and total destruction in high definition. "You just locked their client databases, their financial records, their internal communication systems, and their entire operational infrastructure. You did not ruin my company today, Brandon. You just comprehensively, spectacularly, and irreversibly destroyed your own." As though responding to a perfectly timed theatrical cue, the cell phone in Brandon's jacket pocket began to ring. The loud, generic ringtone cut through the dead silence of the marble lobby like an alarm. Brandon slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew the device. The caller ID displayed the name of his chief executive officer. Brandon's hands were trembling so violently he nearly dropped the phone entirely. He swiped the screen and pressed it slowly to his ear. He did not even have the opportunity to speak. Even from several feet away, I could hear the muffled, explosive screaming erupting from the speaker. A torrent of fury about an unprecedented system failure, a catastrophic and company-wide data breach, and a traced origin point leading directly to Brandon's assigned hardware. "No, sir. Please, just listen to me," Brandon stammered, his voice fracturing, tears of pure panic pooling visibly in his eyes. "It was a mistake. I had no idea. Someone planted it. Someone set me up." The screaming on the other end only intensified in volume and fury. I heard the words "terminated immediately," "federal authorities," and multi-million-dollar lawsuit before the line went dead with a sharp, final click. Brandon lowered the phone. The arrogant, slick regional sales director who had strutted into my lobby 40 minutes ago demanding $500,000 was gone, replaced by a hollow, trembling shell. His knees buckled beneath him. He dropped the infected laptop onto the hard marble floor with a sickening crack and collapsed entirely. his hands pressing against his face as he began to sob, openly, pathetically, and completely without dignity. Brenda crumpled to her knees beside him, wailing and clutching his shoulders in both hands, the full weight of comprehension finally breaking through her denial. Her golden child had just single-handedly annihilated the last remaining source of income their family possessed. I looked down at both of them with zero pity and absolutely no hesitation. But the performance was not entirely over. Vanessa was still standing. She gripped her phone with white-knuckled intensity, her hand shaking visibly, but her face was contorted into a mask of pure, concentrated malice that had not softened by a single degree. She leveled her finger directly at my chest, her acrylic nails practically vibrating with barely contained rage, clearly preparing to launch her final desperate offensive. "You think you are so extraordinarily clever," Vanessa shrieked, her voice reverberating harshly off the vaulted marble ceiling. "You think you ruined my brother, but you have clearly forgotten exactly who you are dealing with." She raised her smartphone higher, ensuring the camera captured every second of what she had convinced herself would be my ultimate, inescapable humiliation. She wanted her online audience to watch me crumble in real time. She wanted to broadcast my defeat to the entire world in high definition. "Go ahead and celebrate your little computer virus trick, Allison," Vanessa sneered, closing the distance between us by another step. "Because while you were busy playing amateur hacker with Brandon, I was hitting you precisely where it actually hurts. Your wallet." I did not interrupt her. I made no move to take the phone from her hand. In my profession, when a criminal voluntarily begins their own confession, the correct and only strategy is to let them speak until they have completely exhausted themselves. "You thought you locked us out of absolutely everything?" Vanessa crowed, a sickeningly triumphant smile spreading slowly across her face. "But Terrence is not the only person in our household who understands their way around a financial statement. I located the routing numbers for your offshore backup account, the one you believed you had buried beyond anyone's reach. I logged into the portal this morning while we were loading the rental truck. I initiated a direct, untraceable wire transfer. I drained exactly $100,000 from your secret reserve, Allison. It is gone. It is sitting inside an encrypted shell account that you will never, under any circumstances, locate or recover." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the number land. "So tell me honestly, who is the real loser standing in this lobby?" Brenda stopped sobbing over her ruined son for precisely one fraction of a second. A glimmer of desperate, greedy hope flickered briefly in the older woman's tear-streaked eyes. Brandon looked up from the floor, his shattered expression rearranging itself around a pathetic, grasping spark of potential salvation. They both genuinely believed that Vanessa had just rescued their sinking ship. They thought she had secured their future with a single transaction. I looked at Vanessa steadily. I did not scream. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I raised my left arm slowly, pulled back the cuff of my blazer with 2 fingers, and glanced briefly at the face of my watch. 10 seconds, I said quietly. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa snapped, her triumphant smile faltering for the very first time since she had entered my building. "I am counting down," I replied, my voice carrying that particular brand of icy, lethal calm that I reserved for moments of absolute, irreversible finality. "Because you just confessed, on a live public broadcast, to committing federal wire fraud, Vanessa. And the individuals who are specifically tasked with monitoring those particular financial transactions are extraordinarily punctual." Precisely on cue, the heavy revolving doors at the front entrance of the lobby began to turn. The entire room seemed to collectively hold its breath as a group of highly coordinated individuals entered the building in a single, purposeful formation. Leading them was Terrence. He was dressed in a sharply tailored navy suit, carrying himself with the composed authority of the high-powered certified public accountant he had always been. But he had not come alone. Flanking him on both sides were 4 individuals wearing heavy tactical vests, and printed across the back of those vests in bold, unmistakable yellow block letters were 3 initials: FBI. Vanessa lowered her phone. Her mouth fell open in sheer paralyzed disbelief. Terrence did not glance at Brandon crumpled on the floor. He did not acknowledge Brenda kneeling beside him. He walked with measured, deliberate strides directly toward his wife, stopping just a few feet from where she stood completely frozen. His expression carried no anger. Nothing so raw or uncontrolled as that. What his face held was something profoundly worse: the absolute clinical detachment of a man who had severed every remaining emotional tie and arrived solely to deliver a final, irrevocable verdict. "Hello, Vanessa," Terrence said, his voice carrying with perfect, unhurried clarity across the breathless silence of the marble lobby. "I see you finally decided to put your internet banking skills to good use," Terrence said, his voice carrying a dry, measured composure that cut through the tension of the lobby like a blade. "Terrence, what is this?" Vanessa stammered, stumbling backward a shaky half-step, her eyes darting frantically between her husband and the agents flanking him. "Why are federal agents here? Tell them to arrest Allison. She is the one hiding money. I simply took back what rightfully belongs to our family." Terrence let out a short, dry, entirely humorless laugh. He adjusted his suit jacket with deliberate calm and looked his wife directly in the eyes without blinking. "You did not steal from Allison," Terrence stated, enunciating every single word with precise, measured intent so that the full reality of her situation could properly and completely shatter her delusion. "That offshore backup account you believed you had so cleverly discovered was not a hidden asset. It was a honeypot. A decoy account established exclusively by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and monitored around the clock by their cybercrime division." The color drained from Vanessa's face in a single, visible wave. The smartphone slipped from her trembling fingers and struck the polished marble floor with a sharp crack, the screen fracturing instantly on impact. "When I packed my bags and left the house at 2 a.m, Terrence continued, delivering each fatal word with masterful, unhurried precision, "I did not simply go to a hotel to clear my head. I went directly to the federal field office. I handed over the physical hard drive containing comprehensive documented proof of you opening fraudulent lines of credit in my name. I provided them with the complete paper trail showing how you siphoned $50,000 to fund your mother's gambling addiction. But the federal agents needed to catch you in the active execution of a cybercrime in order to immediately secure an arrest warrant without enduring a lengthy grand jury indictment process." I stepped forward and positioned myself shoulder to shoulder with Terrence. We were the professionals. They were the parasites. "So Terrence and I coordinated a trap together," I explained, looking down with absolute calm at the 3 of them. "I deliberately left an unencrypted digital breadcrumb on the home network, a trail leading precisely to that specific routing number. We understood with complete confidence that your sheer, ungovernable greed would blind you to every basic security protocol. We knew you would attempt to steal whatever you could physically reach before the eviction was finalized and the doors closed permanently behind you. You authorized a wire transfer of $100,000 across state lines." A tall, imposing FBI agent stepped forward, his badge catching the light beneath the lobby's overhead illumination. "That action constitutes felony wire fraud, criminal computer intrusion, and money laundering under federal statutes," he stated, his voice carrying the flat, unambiguous authority of someone who had delivered this particular notification many times before. "The moment you clicked confirm in your web browser, our monitoring system flagged your IP address and initiated the arrest protocol. You did not secure a retirement fund this morning, ma'am. You secured a federal indictment." Vanessa released a horrific, guttural shriek that filled the lobby from wall to wall. It was the sound of a predator comprehending, in one devastating instant, that it had walked directly and irreversibly into a steel cage. She lunged backward in a wild, panicked scramble, her eyes searching desperately for any available exit. But two federal agents were already closing in from both sides with practiced, inescapable speed. "Vanessa, turn around and place your hands behind your back," the lead agent commanded, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or appeal. "No, you cannot do this to me," Vanessa screamed, thrashing violently as the agents took hold of her arms with firm, controlled precision. "I am a mother. Terrence, tell them to stop. Brandon, do something. Mom, help me, please." Brandon was still kneeling on the marble floor beside his destroyed laptop, completely and utterly catatonic, a man whose entire internal architecture had simply ceased to function. Brenda was weeping in full, hysterical disintegration, one hand pressed against her chest, watching her daughter being physically subdued before her eyes. Neither of them could offer a single fraction of assistance. They were both drowning in the same sinking ship, fighting the same rising water, with nothing left to offer anyone. The harsh, metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the lobby for the second time that morning. The agent secured Vanessa's wrists firmly behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, his voice steady and measured over the chaos of Vanessa's sobbing. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Terrence looked at his wife standing in handcuffs across the lobby. There was no pity in his expression. There was no residual grief, no lingering doubt, no hesitation of any kind. There was only the deep, quiet, exhausted relief of a man who had spent years in captivity and had finally, irrevocably, broken free. "I filed the emergency custody orders this morning," Terrence told her quietly, his voice stripped of all drama and performance. "My son is safe. You will never use him as leverage against me again. My attorney will personally serve you the divorce papers in federal lockup." Vanessa dissolved into absolute hyperventilating panic as the agents marched her with firm, purposeful strides toward the revolving doors. She twisted her neck at the last possible moment, sending one final venomous glare burning in my direction across the lobby. "This is your fault, Allison!" she shrieked, tears streaming freely down her face, her voice cracking under the weight of her own collapse. "You destroyed us. You ruined everything we had." I watched her being escorted through the doors and into the waiting transport vehicle, surrounded on all sides by federal agents. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single drop of remorse. Not one. "No, Vanessa," I said softly to the empty space she had left behind. "I simply handed you the rope. You are the one who chose to tie the knot." 3 months later, the air inside the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was thick, suffocating and heavy with the particular tension that precedes a reckoning that has been a long time coming. The polished mahogany benches and towering marble pillars created a stark, almost theatrical contrast to the absolute moral filth that was about to be exposed and dragged permanently into the light. I sat perfectly upright at the plaintiff's table, wearing a precisely tailored charcoal suit, my hands folded with deliberate composure over a pristine leather folder. Beside me sat Harrison, wearing the expression of a man who had already decided the outcome and was simply enjoying the formalities. Across the aisle, the defense table looked like the final portrait of collapsed entitlement. Brandon, Brenda, and Vanessa sat huddled together in a defeated, diminished cluster. A tableau of everything that happens when arrogance finally meets consequence. Brandon wore a poorly fitted suit that appeared to have been retrieved from the back shelf of a discount rack. His previously immaculate hair had visibly thinned, and his posture had collapsed inward on itself. Brenda sat rigidly beside him, her roots entirely grown out, clutching a crumpled tissue in both hands and attempting with visible desperation to project the image of a frail, fundamentally misunderstood grandmother who had simply been caught in circumstances beyond her control. Vanessa, having spent the preceding 90 days in federal holding due to her formally assessed flight risk status, wore a standard-issue institutional jumpsuit and stared at the floor with hollow, sunken eyes that had lost whatever fire they once carried. Because their assets had been entirely frozen or seized outright by federal authorities, they could not afford the caliber of legal defense the complexity of their charges demanded. Instead, they had retained a bargain-rate attorney named Mr. Gable, a man who appeared perpetually damp with anxiety and visibly overwhelmed by the sheer accumulated magnitude of the federal charges cascading down upon his clients. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense, deeply experienced woman with decades of specialized practice in financial crimes, adjusted her glasses with 2 fingers and signaled with calm authority for the defense to begin their preliminary arguments for the combined criminal and civil hearing. Mr. Gable rose from his chair, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief before it had even fully left his pocket. He launched immediately into the exact fabricated narrative we had anticipated and prepared for in exhaustive detail. He attempted to paint me as a ruthless, wealthy corporate tyrant who had maliciously and methodically entrapped a naive, loving family out of nothing more than personal vindictiveness. "Your Honor," Mr. Gable began, his voice wavering noticeably under the sharp, penetrating weight of the judge's gaze. "My clients are not criminal masterminds. They are simply a family who made a series of poor and deeply regrettable decisions during a period of extreme emotional distress. The plaintiff, a highly aggressive and exceptionally resourced financial expert, used her considerable wealth and specialized technical knowledge to deliberately entrap them. The credit card usage in question was nothing more than a misunderstanding between a newly engaged couple navigating a complicated financial dynamic. The transfer of the residential property was a sudden, vindictive act designed to render an elderly woman homeless without warning or recourse. This entire proceeding is a gross and disproportionate overreaction by a scorned woman seeking to punish her former fiancé for experiencing entirely human cold feet. I did not flinch. I did not sigh. I did not allow a single visible reaction to cross my face. I simply turned my head slightly and offered Harrison a micro-expression of absolute, unambiguous boredom. Harrison smirked with quiet satisfaction, buttoned his suit jacket with one hand, and rose to his feet. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace the room with theatrical gestures or manufactured courtroom drama. He simply walked with deliberate calm to the evidence projector and connected his encrypted tablet. "Your Honor," Harrison said, his voice a low, resonant command that instantly reorganized the attention of every person in the room. "The defense claims this matter represents a simple misunderstanding between family members. They characterize my client as a vindictive predator pursuing personal revenge. I would like to submit Exhibit A to the court, which will definitively and comprehensively establish that the only predators present in this courtroom today are seated at the defense table." A massive, high-resolution document materialized on the screens positioned throughout the courtroom. It was the fraudulent post-nuptial agreement that Terrence had intercepted on the night of the rehearsal dinner. The document that had first confirmed, in black ink, the true nature of what had been planned. "This document," Harrison continued, pacing with measured slowness toward the witness stand, "is a unilateral and wholly coercive transfer of assets. It was drafted in secret by a disbarred paralegal hired specifically and covertly by Brandon and Vanessa. It states explicitly that upon signing, my client would forfeit 50% of her multi-million-dollar forensic accounting firm and 50% of her residential estate to Brandon, in perpetuity, with no consideration offered in return." Mr. Gable lurched to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. There is no substantiated proof that my clients ever intended to execute this unverified document. It is nothing more than an informal draft downloaded from a generic legal template website. Harrison did not spare him a glance. He tapped his tablet and brought up an entirely new exhibit. "I submit Exhibit B, Your Honor," Harrison stated with smooth, unruffled composure, allowing Mr. Gable's desperate objection to evaporate without acknowledgement. "This is a sworn, notarized affidavit from the head bartender contracted for the wedding reception. The affidavit confirms that the defendant Vanessa approached him directly and offered him $5,000 in cash to systematically administer a potent narcotic into the bride's drinks at regular intervals throughout the evening. In addition, we have the encrypted text message exchange between Vanessa and Brandon detailing their explicit, step-by-step plan to wait until my client was chemically incapacitated, escort her to the bridal suite, and physically compel her hand to sign this fraudulent contract under the deliberately misleading pretense of a routine venue noise waiver." An audible, collective gasp swept through the gallery like a wave. The judge leaned forward incrementally, her eyes narrowing into sharp, dangerous slits as her gaze descended on the defense table with the full weight of judicial contempt. Brandon shrank so far back into his chair, he appeared to be attempting to disappear inside it entirely. Brenda dropped her tissue to the floor, her jaw hanging open in an expression of sheer, undisguised terror. They had not known we had located the bartender. They had not known their predatory scheme had been fully documented and preserved in federal records long before this morning. But Harrison was nowhere near finished. He had barely begun. He tapped the screen again and shifted with ruthless mechanical efficiency to his next exhibit. The defense also contends that the unauthorized use of my client's social security number was a simple misunderstanding between engaged partners, Harrison said, bringing up a complex annotated digital roadmap populated with red data points that stretched across the full width of the display. Exhibit C contains raw IP address logs, precise geolocation tracking data, and device identification codes retrieved directly from the credit bureaus by federal investigators. These logs establish beyond any reasonable interpretation that Brandon submitted applications for $50,000 in credit limits while seated at his corporate office, where he deployed a secure virtual private network in an explicit attempt to mask his geographic location. He then arranged for the physical cards to be routed to a private post office box he had opened exactly 3 days prior. Harrison turned his back to the screens and fixed Mr. Gable with a direct, unhurried stare. "You do not rent a secret mailbox for a marital misunderstanding. You rent a secret mailbox to commit calculated, premeditated felony identity theft." Every single keystroke Brandon executed was captured, time-stamped, and permanently preserved by federal systems. He attempted to conceal his digital tracks from a woman whose entire professional career is built upon the singular skill of locating needles buried in digital haystacks. The atmosphere in the courtroom had grown almost unbearably dense. The suffocating, inescapable weight of undeniable, concrete financial evidence was crushing the defense from every direction simultaneously. Mr. Gable was shuffling his papers with increasingly frantic, inefficient movements, his face glistening openly with panic, searching with visible desperation for a legal loophole that did not exist and had never existed. "The defendants did not make a series of unfortunate mistakes, Your Honor," Harrison concluded, his voice resonating through the courtroom with the absolute clarity of finality. "They executed a coordinated, malicious, and sustained financial strike against my client. They operated as a highly organized criminal enterprise, using the intimacy of familial trust as a weapon to systematically drain accounts, forge legal documents, and plan a physical assault designed to steal a corporate empire from within. We are not appearing before this court today to request leniency. We are demanding maximum federal sentencing on every single charge enumerated on this docket." Harrison returned to his chair and sat down beside me with composed precision. The silence that followed was absolute. The judge surveyed Brandon, Brenda, and Vanessa with an expression of unambiguous judicial contempt that required no translation. Their attorney settled slowly back into his seat with the hollow, broken posture of a man who had just walked, eyes open, into a legal slaughterhouse, and had only now understood where he was standing. The trap had closed completely. The walls had finished their journey inward. There was no space left. The suffocating silence was finally broken by the sharp, authoritative crack of the judge's gavel against the bench. She shifted her penetrating gaze from the trembling figure of Brandon to the woman sitting rigidly beside him. Brenda was gripping her crumpled tissue so tightly her knuckles had turned bone white. Every trace of the aggressive, imperious matriarch she had performed with such conviction had completely dissolved. In its place was something far smaller and far more desperate, the performance of a frail, confused, innocent grandmother who had simply been swept helplessly along by her son's unfortunate poor judgment. Mr. Gable rose again, his suit jacket visibly wrinkled and his confidence reduced to a thin, precarious thread by the evidentiary devastation of the preceding hour. He cleared his throat with labored effort, preparing to attempt whatever minimal fragment of sympathy the court might still retain for the elderly woman seated beside his other clients, and knowing, with reasonable certainty, that there was very little left to find. "Your Honor," Mr. Gable began, his voice stripped of any real conviction, as though he himself no longer believed the words he was about to deliver. "While the evidence against Brandon is certainly complex and multifaceted, I must implore this court to look carefully and compassionately at my client, Brenda. She is a 62-year-old widow. She was recently and abruptly evicted from her home of many years and was operating under a state of profound emotional distress. She had absolutely no knowledge of the unauthorized credit accounts or the fraudulent contracts her son and daughter were allegedly drafting behind closed doors. She simply needed a roof over her head. She is a victim of circumstance, a vulnerable senior citizen who should not be penalized for the reckless actions of a younger generation she had no power to control. Punishing her alongside her children would constitute a cruel and disproportionate overreach of the justice system." I leaned back in my chair with deliberate ease and rested my hands on the mahogany surface of the table. I glanced at Harrison. He did not bother to write down a single note. He simply offered me a brief predatory smile before rising smoothly to his feet and addressing the bench. "Your Honor," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the room with the effortless authority of a man entirely at home in a federal courtroom. "The defense is asking this court to believe that Brenda is a fragile, innocent bystander, a bewildered grandmother swept up helplessly in the criminal ambitions of her own children. They want you to extend sympathy to a woman they are framing as a victim of the very family she raised. But in the discipline of forensic accounting, we do not adjudicate based on tears or tissues. We adjudicate based on ledgers. And Brenda's ledger tells a story of systematic, calculated, and extraordinarily lucrative federal fraud." Mr. Gable sank back into his chair and pressed his fingertips slowly to his temples. He knew precisely what was coming. He had known since the moment the evidence screens first illuminated. "When my client initiated a forensic trace on the funds used to retire Brenda's immediate casino debts," Harrison continued, pacing in a measured, deliberate line in front of the evidence screens, "she was required to verify the origin accounts. We have already established that Brandon used my client's stolen identity to transfer $30,000 directly to a casino holding company. But that transaction raised a professionally significant and deeply interesting question. How was an unemployed widow sustaining a high-roller gambling addiction for over a full decade before Brandon was forced to resort to identity theft to keep the arrangement afloat?" Harrison tapped his tablet. A new set of financial documents populated the high-definition screens with immediate, undeniable clarity. These were not credit card statements or commercial banking records. They were federal banking documents bearing official government seals. "I submit Exhibit D, Your Honor," Harrison announced, his tone sharpening to a razor's edge. "This is a comprehensive 10-year audit of a checking account registered to Brenda's late husband. According to state death registries, he passed away exactly 120 months ago. However, according to the federal pension system, he has been alive and in excellent health, receiving direct deposits of his full government retirement benefits on the first of every single month for the entirety of the last decade." A visible shockwave moved through the courtroom in a single, collective breath. Stealing from a private citizen was a serious criminal matter. Defrauding the federal government of the United States was an entirely different and catastrophically more severe tier of legal destruction. And everyone present understood the distinction immediately. Brenda released a sharp, strangled gasp. Her eyes darted in wild, panicked arcs around the room as the full weight of comprehension collapsed on her. The deepest, most carefully guarded secret of her entire adult life had just been projected in high definition onto a 20-foot screen inside a federal courthouse, before a judge, a gallery of witnesses, and the permanent record of the court. "Your Honor," Harrison stated, directing a firm, unwavering finger toward the projected bank statements. "For 10 consecutive years, Brenda failed to report her husband's death to the pension authority. Not through oversight, not through confusion, but through active and deliberate concealment. She personally forged his signature on the annual proof-of-life verification forms required by the government each year. She maintained his private checking account and allowed the federal funds to deposit automatically and without interruption. She then systematically transferred those funds into a secondary shell account registered under her maiden name, effectively laundering the money before withdrawing it as untraceable cash directly on the casino floor." The judge had fixed her gaze on the screens with an expression carved from pure, barely contained fury. The defrauding of a federal pension program was not merely a financial crime in this courtroom. It was a direct and personal insult to the institution she had spent her career serving. "She stole over $400,000 in federal funds across the course of a decade," Harrison continued, his voice striking the room with the force and cadence of a hammer hitting an anvil. But her hubris and her appetite did not stop there. Because these funds were technically stolen from the moment they were received, Brenda never declared a single penny of this income to the Internal Revenue Service. She committed a full decade of aggravated tax evasion while using federal taxpayer dollars to sustain her slot machine addiction, simultaneously defrauding 2 separate branches of the federal government for 10 uninterrupted years. Mr. Gable did not attempt to stand. He did not attempt to object. There existed no coherent defense against a certified forensic paper trail documenting 10 years of systematic federal theft, and every person in the room understood that with complete clarity. He simply sat in place, staring blankly at his legal pad, visibly calculating the earliest moment at which he could professionally distance himself from this catastrophic proceeding. "She is not a frail and confused widow," Harrison concluded, pivoting to fix his piercing gaze directly on Brenda with an expression that contained no trace of mercy. "She is a seasoned, calculated, and experienced grifter who has been systematically stealing from the tax-paying citizens of this country for 10 consecutive years. The only reason her scheme unraveled when it did is because her own entitlement became uncontrollable. If she had not forced her way into my client's home, if she had not demanded to sleep in her bed, commandeered her living space, and hurled her personal belongings into the corridor, my client would never have been provoked into opening a financial investigation. The singular reason Brenda is seated at that defense table today is her own staggering, catastrophic sense of entitlement." Harrison returned to his seat. The silence that descended on the courtroom was absolute, airless, and heavy with the particular weight of justice that has been a long time arriving. The judge looked down from the bench, her expression carved from pure judicial ice. She adjusted her glasses with 2 deliberate fingers and addressed the defense table in a voice that offered no mercy, no ambiguity, and no exit. This court has reviewed the submitted financial records in their entirety, the judge stated with measured, irrevocable clarity. The evidence of federal pension fraud and tax evasion is overwhelming, exhaustive, and entirely irrefutable. Based on the severity and duration of these federal offenses, I am immediately revoking any and all state-provided welfare benefits the defendant currently receives, effective this moment. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate freezing of all remaining assets connected in any capacity to her name, pending full federal restitution proceedings. Brenda began to shake with uncontrollable, visible violence. The crumpled tissue tumbled from her fingers and settled silently on the floor. This court is officially referring this specific matter to the federal prosecutor's office for immediate criminal indictment, the judge continued, delivering the final crushing blow with the steady cadence of a verdict that had always been inevitable. You are facing mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines applicable to the defrauding of a federal institution. You will be looking at a significant and substantial term inside a federal penitentiary. The reality of those words, precise, unambiguous, and absolute, finally penetrated the thick, decades-old armor of delusion that Brenda had constructed and maintained around herself throughout her entire adult life. The realization that her golden years would not be spent presiding over a luxury master bedroom, issuing orders from a comfortable sofa, and demanding to be accommodated by the people around her, but instead inside a concrete federal prison cell, struck her with the force of a freight train traveling at full speed. Brenda released a horrific guttural wail that reverberated off the marble walls of the courtroom and echoed down the corridor beyond the heavy doors. The facade of the innocent, bewildered grandmother dissolved completely and without remainder. She collapsed forward, her forehead striking the heavy wooden surface of the defense table with a hollow thud, and began sobbing with the unrestrained, uncontrolled abandon of someone who has lost everything in a single moment and knows it with total certainty. She reached out blindly, seizing Brandon's arm with both hands, her fingers digging deep into the fabric of his cheap suit with desperate, clawing urgency. "Brandon, do something!" Brenda shrieked, her voice fracturing under the full catastrophic weight of her panic. "Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them I did not know anything. You have to fix this right now. Please, please do not let them put me in a cell." Brandon did not move. He did not speak. He did not reach out to comfort her, or even acknowledge her presence. He simply sat in his chair, staring blankly and vacantly ahead, entirely paralyzed beneath the crushing reality of his own impending fate. He could not save her. He lacked the capacity to save himself. They were both descending toward the ocean floor together, pulled down with equal and irresistible force by the combined weight of the chains their own phenomenal, insatiable greed had forged around them. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, my posture perfect, my expression entirely serene. I watched the woman who had sneered at me with contempt in my own home, the woman who had issued me instructions to sleep on my own sofa and thrown my belongings into a hallway, weeping with hysterical, ugly desperation as her entire constructed existence was legally and methodically dismantled piece by piece in open court. It was a flawless, devastating, and thoroughly deserved execution of justice. And we still had 2 more defendants left to address. The echoing wails from Brenda were finally subdued as 2 court bailiffs escorted the hysterical woman through a side door into a holding room adjacent to the main courtroom. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them with a sound of finality, leaving behind a tense, charged, electrically alive atmosphere. Brandon remained slumped in his chair, a thoroughly defeated, hollowed-out shell of the arrogant man who had once believed himself capable of stealing an empire. But the legal reckoning was far from complete. There was one remaining parasite at the defense table who still required permanent and total eradication. Vanessa sat in her standard-issue federal jumpsuit with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her sunken eyes burning with a concentrated, toxic mixture of barely contained panic and pure, undiluted venom. She had spent the last 90 days confined in federal lockup, a stark and inescapable contrast to the lavish lifestyle she had conspired and schemed to steal. The distance between the life she had imagined and the one she was currently inhabiting had never been more absolute. The judge adjusted her microphone and consulted her docket. "The prosecution may call its next witness," she stated, her voice carrying its characteristic sharp, no-nonsense authority throughout the room. Harrison stood, smoothing the front of his tailored jacket with one deliberate hand. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Terrence to the stand." The heavy doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. Terrence walked down the center aisle, and the entire room seemed to shift on its axis at his entrance. He wore an immaculate, razor-sharp navy suit, and his posture was perfectly erect, projecting the composed, unshakable confidence of a man who had walked through hell at considerable personal cost and had emerged from the other side completely and permanently fireproof. His expression carried no anger, no residual bitterness, no trace of the wounded man Vanessa had attempted to reduce him to. He looked entirely, clinically composed. He walked past the defense table without offering Vanessa so much as a single glance, climbed the steps to the witness box with measured strides, and swore the oath in a clear, steady voice. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile from my seat at the plaintiff's table. Terrence and I had orchestrated this precise moment across dozens of carefully encrypted calls over the preceding 3 months. He was not merely a star witness, he was the executioner, and he had arrived fully prepared. Harrison approached the podium. "Please state your name and profession for the record." "My name is Terrence," he replied, his deep voice carrying with effortless clarity across the silent courtroom. "I am a certified public accountant, fully licensed and actively practicing in the state of Illinois." "And what is your relationship to the defendant Vanessa?" Harrison asked. Terrence folded his hands and rested them on the wooden railing of the witness box with deliberate composure. "I am currently, in a legal capacity, married to her. However, I would like to address the court directly on that specific matter at this time." Terrence reached inside his suit jacket and withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope. He turned to the court bailiff standing nearby and extended it with a steady hand. "I am formally requesting the court bailiff to serve this document to the defense table," Terrence stated with quiet, practiced smoothness. Mr. Gable, the perpetually perspiring defense attorney, accepted the envelope from the bailiff with a look of bewildered apprehension and tore it open. Vanessa leaned sharply over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the dense legal text with increasing urgency. "What is this?" Vanessa hissed, her voice fracturing as the meaning of the document fully registered. "It is a unilateral petition for divorce," Terrence answered, meeting her eyes directly and without flinching for the very first time since entering the room. "Along with an emergency motion for sole legal and physical custody of our son. You are being formally served in open court, Vanessa." Vanessa lunged to her feet, the heavy chains around her ankles rattling sharply and loudly against the wooden floor. "You cannot do this to me!" she screamed, her face twisting into a mask of absolute, unrestrained rage. "I am your wife. We are a family. You are supposed to stand by me and protect me. You owe me that." "Order in this court," the judge barked, bringing her gavel down with a sharp, deafening crack that silenced the room instantly. "Defendant, sit down immediately or you will be physically restrained." Vanessa dropped back into her seat, breathing in sharp, audible bursts, her eyes fixed on Terrence with an intensity of pure hatred that seemed to radiate physical heat. Harrison did not pause for even a fraction of a second. He stepped forward with fluid, unhurried purpose. Terrence, as a certified public accountant, did you have occasion to conduct a forensic audit of your personal household finances following the events of October the 12th? I did, Terrence replied, his tone shifting into the register of absolute professional detachment he had spent years developing. Because my wife was actively participating in an attempted theft of a multi-million-dollar estate, I had substantial professional and personal grounds to suspect that our own marital accounts had been similarly compromised. My forensic audit confirmed those suspicions. It revealed a highly systematic, extensively premeditated campaign of domestic financial abuse conducted against me over a period of 14 months. Harrison directed the court's attention to the evidence scripture. I submit Exhibit E, Your Honor. Over the course of 14 months, Terrence stated, gesturing to the financial documents now populating the monitors, Vanessa systematically bypassed the multi-factor authentication protocols on my personal devices. She intercepted my secure physical and digital mail. She then forged my digital signature to execute 3 separate high-yield personal loans totaling $50,000 in aggregate. She funneled this stolen capital through a decentralized digital payment processor specifically to avoid triggering standard banking fraud flags. And where, precisely, did those funds ultimately go? Harrison asked, guiding the testimony with practiced surgical precision. Every single dollar was routed directly to her mother, Brenda, to cover exorbitant outstanding casino markers and to prevent illegal loan sharks from collecting on accumulated gambling debts, Terrence stated, his voice carrying with absolute, unshakable clarity. Vanessa burdened my name, my credit score, and my professional standing in the financial industry with $50,000 of fraudulently accrued debt. Without my knowledge, without my consent, and without any intention of ever disclosing it to me. She weaponized my career and my professional credibility as a protective shield for her family's criminal enterprise. Mr. Gable sat in his chair in a state of complete, motionless paralysis. He had nothing to say and no meaningful mechanism with which to say it. You cannot cross-examine a master accountant who arrives at a federal hearing carrying irrefutable, time-stamped banking logs and a forensic audit trail. But the domestic fraud is not the primary reason the defendant is wearing a federal jumpsuit in this courtroom today, is it? Harrison prompted, pivoting cleanly toward the final decisive blow. No, it is not, Terrence confirmed. On the morning of October the 13th, I was present in the lobby of my colleague's corporate headquarters. I personally and directly witnessed Vanessa voluntarily admit, on a live public broadcast of her own creation, to bypassing a secure server. I watched her hold her smartphone above her head and publicly boast about initiating a wire transfer of $100,000 across state lines. And whose account was she representing herself as targeting? Harrison asked. She believed she was robbing the plaintiff, Allison, Terrence said, glancing briefly in my direction with an expression of profound, earned, mutual respect. However, as a licensed financial professional, I had already identified and analyzed the specific account she was targeting. I recognized immediately that it was a federal honeypot, a decoy account established exclusively by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to monitor and track active cyber fraud syndicates. When Vanessa confirmed the wire transfer, she committed federal wire fraud, criminal computer intrusion, and money laundering in a single keystroke. She walked directly into a federal trap because her greed had completely and entirely overwhelmed her capacity for basic digital security reasoning. Vanessa could no longer contain the venom that had been building inside her throughout the entirety of Terrence's testimony. She slammed both palms flat against the defense table with a sound like a gunshot, dismissing her attorney's frantic, whispered warnings without a glance. "You set me up!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice careening wildly off the high ceilings of the courtroom. "You and that cold-blooded corporate witch engineered this entire thing together. You sold me out deliberately. You were absolutely nothing before my family brought you in and gave you a place to belong. You owe everything you have to us." Terrence did not raise his voice. He did not raise an eyebrow. He leaned forward into the microphone with the unhurried composure of a man delivering a verdict he had been preparing for months, and spoke in a voice that cut cleanly through her screaming like a blade through still water. "Your family took my credit score," Terrence stated, looking directly at his wife for the last time. "I built my career with my own two hands, across years of work that had nothing to do with any of you. You simply extracted value from it until there was nothing remaining to take. I am not selling you out, Vanessa. I am taking out the trash." The judge's gavel came down twice in rapid, thunderous succession. The sound commanded silence instantly and completely. "That is enough," the judge declared, her voice radiating the full, unambiguous weight of judicial authority. "The evidence presented before this court today is staggering in both its scope and its specificity. The defendant systematically used her own husband as a financial instrument and then willingly attempted to rob a federal decoy account out of sheer, calculated malice." The judge turned her attention directly to the custody motion resting on her desk, studying it briefly before lifting her gaze. "Based on the irrefutable evidence of ongoing federal crimes, severe and demonstrated financial instability, and the defendant's current status as an incarcerated flight risk, I am granting the emergency custody motion in its entirety. Terrence is hereby awarded sole legal and physical custody of the minor child, effective immediately and without condition. The defendant is stripped of all visitation rights pending the completion of a comprehensive psychological evaluation." Vanessa released a horrific guttural cry that filled the courtroom from floor to ceiling. She lunged forward with wild desperation, reaching for her attorney, straining toward the witness stand, her hands outstretched and grasping at anything within reach. But two federal marshals were already moving in from behind with practiced, inescapable speed and purpose. "Furthermore," the judge continued, her voice completely unwavering beneath the chaos unfolding before her, "due to the severity and deliberate nature of the wire fraud and money laundering charges, I am revoking any and all possibility of bail. The defendant is remanded to federal custody, pending immediate transfer to a correctional facility for sentencing." Vanessa screamed with full-throated, unrestrained fury as the marshals took hold of her arms. She hurled vile, increasingly incoherent insults at Terrence, at me, and at the judge herself, as she was forcibly removed from the defense table, her voice fading with diminishing coherence down the long, echoing corridor of the courthouse, until the sound disappeared entirely, and the room settled into a silence so profound it had its own specific texture and weight. Terrence stepped down from the witness box with the measured calm of a man completing a task he had carried for a very long time. He crossed the floor and came to stand beside me at the plaintiff's table. Together, we looked at the empty chairs where the arrogant, parasitic triumvirate had sat just an hour ago, chairs that now held nothing but air. The checkmate had been absolute and total. We had reduced their entire constructed empire to ash and rubble, and we had not needed to light a single match ourselves. They had provided the gasoline with both hands and a great deal of enthusiasm. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind the federal marshals, sealing the courtroom in a stunned, ringing silence that seemed to vibrate with its own particular frequency. Two of the three parasites had been systematically and permanently excised. One remained. Brandon sat alone at the defense table, entirely isolated for the first time in the entirety of these proceedings. His mother was in a holding cell. His sister was in federal transit. Every layer of familial insulation, every human shield he had relied upon throughout his entire adult life, had been stripped away with clinical precision. He looked up at the judge with the wide, cornered eyes of an animal that has finally and completely run out of room to maneuver. Mr. Gable rose to his feet for the final time. The defense attorney was perspiring visibly and heavily, his tie loosened, his jacket rumpled at the shoulders. A man who appeared to be regretting, with considerable specificity, every professional decision that had led him to accept representation of this particular family. He had a legal obligation to mount a defense, however, regardless of how structurally unsound and fundamentally indefensible it had become. Your Honor, Mr. Gable began, his voice entirely devoid of the theatrical confidence he had attempted at the outset of the hearing. This court must carefully and fairly separate the individual actions of the mother and the sister from those of my client, Brandon. The prosecution has constructed a narrative framing him as a calculating criminal mastermind, but what this court is in fact looking at is a simple domestic dispute that has been catastrophically and disproportionately inflated. He straightened slightly, summoning whatever remained of his professional conviction. Regarding the unauthorized use of my client's fiancé's credit information, Brandon and Allison were engaged to be married within 48 hours of the events in question. They were actively in the process of merging every dimension of their lives together. My client operated under a reasonable and sincere legal assumption of implied mutual consent. He utilized her Social Security number to manage unexpected and urgent family expenses, genuinely believing that as future husband and wife, all financial obligations and burdens would be jointly shared going forward. It was poor judgment, certainly, and perhaps a failure of communication, but it was not malicious federal identity theft. It was the frantic, desperate action of a groom attempting to prevent his elderly mother from becoming homeless in the days before he walked down the aisle. I sat with perfect stillness at the plaintiff's table, my face a mask of absolute, composed calm. I had no need to object. I had no need to raise my voice or signal my contempt. I simply looked at Harrison with quiet certainty. Harrison rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with the deliberate, unhurried precision of an executioner making final preparations. Implied mutual consent, Harrison repeated, allowing the phrase to settle in the air of the courtroom for a long, devastatingly effective moment, letting it speak for itself before he dismantled it entirely. The defense is asking this court to accept the position that misappropriating a woman's federally protected identity to finance a decade-long gambling addiction constitutes a standard and reasonable expression of premarital financial partnership. Your Honor, forensic accounting does not operate in the realm of assumptions, intentions, or charitable interpretations. It operates in the realm of absolute, permanently recorded, time-stamped reality. Harrison turned to the evidence screens. I would like to direct the court's full attention to Exhibit F. The massive screens across the courtroom came to life simultaneously. The room was immediately filled with crisp, high-definition night vision footage, sourced directly from the concealed security camera I had installed above the door of my private home office. The timestamp displayed in the lower corner of the frame read 2:45 a.m. on the morning of October the 13th. On the screen, Brandon crept down a darkened hallway in near silence, his cell phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, harsh, urgent whisper. The audio was recovered and rendered with complete crystalline clarity. Brandon's own voice filled the federal courtroom, confirming his guilt before a silent and unblinking audience. I am telling you, the paperwork is hidden somewhere in her office. She has absolutely no idea I used her Social Security number to open those platinum cards. I maxed them both out yesterday. The moment the marriage certificate is signed on Sunday, the debt becomes marital property by operation of law. She will be legally and completely trapped. I just need to locate her client ledgers tonight. I need them as leverage in case she notices the credit hit on her report before the ceremony goes through. The footage continued. It showed Brandon testing the handle of my locked office door, finding it secured, and pacing with visible agitation in the hallway before his eyes landed on the silver USB drive I had positioned with precise deliberateness near the edge of the hallway console table as bait. He snatched it up in a single motion, a greedy, self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face as he brought it close to examine it. "I have got her backup drive," Brandon's recorded voice continued, low and triumphant with barely contained excitement. "I am downloading her entire corporate database right now. We own her completely." Harrison tapped his tablet with a single controlled gesture, and the footage froze, permanently, for the public record, on the precise image of Brandon's smug criminal expression in the moment of his own self-destruction. "Implied mutual consent," Harrison stated, his voice resonating through the courtroom with the full, authoritative weight of judicial finality. The defendant explicitly and voluntarily admitted on recorded audio that his victim possessed zero knowledge of the identity theft being perpetrated against her. He explicitly articulated his predetermined plan to legally trap her within fraudulently accrued marital debt. He explicitly detailed his calculated intention to steal proprietary corporate data for the purpose of blackmailing her into compliant submission. There is no domestic dispute before this court today, Your Honor. There is a calculated, coldly premeditated, and thoroughly documented predatory scheme to financially enslave and professionally destroy a highly accomplished woman, and the man who designed and executed it is sitting at that table. Mr. Gable lowered himself slowly back into his chair and buried his face in both hands with the deliberate finality of a man surrendering to the inevitable. He did not look at Brandon. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the screens. He simply sat with his face covered and said nothing at all. But the financial devastation of the defendant does not end with identity theft. Harrison continued pacing deliberately toward the center of the room, each step measured and purposeful. The defense claims Brandon is merely a desperate groom acting out of love. In reality, he is a corporate terrorist operating with cold premeditation. When the defendant stole that silver USB drive, he genuinely believed he was stealing my client's proprietary forensic database. Instead, through his own reckless arrogance, he stole a highly aggressive ransomware payload. He then willingly, knowingly, and maliciously plugged that drive directly into his employer's secure, firewalled network. Harrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, freshly stamped legal binder, slamming it down onto the defense table with devastating force, directly in front of Brandon's visibly shaking hands. "As of 9 o'clock this morning," Harrison announced, his tone utterly merciless, "the corporate entity previously known as your employer has officially filed a civil lawsuit against you in this very courthouse. By deploying that ransomware payload onto their systems, you caused a catastrophic, system-wide shutdown of their entire global sales database. You corrupted thousands of encrypted, secure client files and rendered them permanently unrecoverable. They are suing you personally for gross negligence, corporate sabotage, and willful breach of fiduciary duty. They are seeking $25 million in immediate compensatory damages, with punitive damages still pending assessment." Brandon let out a strangled, pathetic gasp that seemed to hollow him out completely. He stared at the massive legal binder as if it were a coiled, venomous snake resting inches from his fingertips. His entire body began to tremble violently, an uncontrollable shaking that started in his hands and spread through every limb. The full, crushing realization that he was not merely facing federal prison time, but an entire lifetime of insurmountable, inescapable corporate debt, completely shattered whatever remained of his composure. "You cannot do this to me," Brandon whimpered, his voice cracking and climbing into a high, desperate pitch that filled the courtroom with secondhand shame. "I have nothing. I do not have $25 million. I do not have a house. I do not have a job. You took everything from me." Harrison leaned slowly over the table, looking down at the utterly ruined man without a trace of sympathy. "We did not take anything from you, Brandon. We simply presented you with the invoice for your own spectacular, self-inflicted arrogance." The judge struck her gavel with authority, the sharp sound echoing through the chamber like a final, decisive gunshot. "The court has heard enough. The audio and visual evidence of premeditated federal identity theft and attempted corporate extortion is both overwhelming and irrefutable. The defense's argument of implied consent is entirely and categorically rejected." The judge looked down at Brandon with an expression of absolute, unconcealed disgust. "You attempted to financially destroy an innocent woman and ended up single-handedly destroying the very corporation that employed and trusted you. Your sheer, boundless greed is matched only by your truly staggering incompetence. You are hereby remanded to federal custody without bail, pending final sentencing." Two armed federal marshals stepped forward immediately, seizing Brandon firmly by the arms and hauling him roughly upright out of his chair. He did not resist. His legs were completely useless beneath him, dragging and scraping against the polished marble floor as they pulled him toward the holding cell doors. The slick, self-assured regional sales director, who had once believed he could conquer my empire, was now nothing more than a terrified, bankrupt prisoner being dragged straight toward federal lockup. The courtroom remained suspended in a state of collective breathlessness as the judge organized the thick stack of legal files on her elevated bench with quiet, methodical precision. The digital clock mounted on the wall seemed to tick louder with every passing second, counting down the final moments of a man who had constructed his entire existence on a crumbling foundation of lies and manipulation. Brandon was standing now, forced upright only by the two federal marshals gripping his arms with iron resolve. His cheap, ill-fitting suit hung off his frame like a borrowed costume from someone 3 sizes larger. He was trembling so violently and continuously that the heavy wooden table in front of him rattled audibly against the polished floor. Mr. Gable had already physically backed away from his client, instinctively distancing himself from the toxic, irreparable fallout. Harrison settled back into his chair beside me, folding his hands contentedly over his stomach, completely and visibly satisfied with the absolute methodical destruction we had just orchestrated together. The judge leaned forward, clasping her hands with solemn deliberation. The sheer weight of judicial authority radiating from her voice commanded the undivided, reverent attention of every single person remaining in the room. "Brandon, you stand before this federal court not as a victim of circumstance, but as the deliberate, calculating architect of your own spectacular demise." The judge began, each word striking the air like a physical blow. "You engaged in a systematic, premeditated campaign of sustained financial terror against the very woman you asked to marry. You stole her secure federal identity without hesitation or remorse. You burdened her name and her credit with massive, fraudulent debt, specifically designed to cover the tracks of your mother's extensive illegal activities. And when you ultimately felt cornered and exposed, you resorted to corporate extortion and deliberately unleashed a devastating cyber attack that crippled an entire financial institution and its thousands of innocent clients." Brandon let out a quiet, barely audible, pathetic whimper, his chin dropping toward his chest in total surrender. "You have shown absolutely zero genuine remorse throughout these proceedings," the judge continued without mercy or pause. "You have demonstrated only regret that you were caught and dismantled by someone considerably smarter, more prepared, and more formidable than you ever anticipated. You viewed the plaintiff not as a human being deserving of dignity and respect, but as a convenient financial target to be systematically exploited. Your extraordinary arrogance led you to believe you could manipulate the federal banking system and the entire corporate sector without ever facing meaningful consequences. Today, The full and unforgiving reality of your actions has finally caught up with you. The room grew perfectly, profoundly still. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Therefore, the judge announced, her voice resonating like rolling thunder across the mahogany-paneled walls, on the charges of aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and corporate sabotage, I sentence you to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. This sentence is to be served consecutively and in its entirety, without the possibility of parole. You are also ordered to pay full financial restitution to the corporate entity you deliberately destroyed, a judgment that guarantees your wages will be garnished for the remainder of your natural life. This court is adjourned. The sharp, definitive crack of the gavel sealed his fate permanently. 7 years. A mandatory federal sentence with no early release for good behavior, no comfortable minimum security facility, no negotiated exit. He was going to a concrete cell for the better part of a decade. Brandon let out a strangled, breathless sob that seemed to collapse his entire chest cavity. His knees buckled completely, but the two imposing federal marshals hauled him upright by his armpits with practiced efficiency. They turned him to face the center aisle. The walk of shame had officially, irreversibly, begun. They dragged him away from the defense table as his luxury leather shoes scraped heavily and uselessly against the polished marble floor. His face was a messy, devastated portrait of streaming tears and undignified anguish. The charismatic, polished regional sales director who had once tried to gaslight me in the foyer of my own home was entirely, permanently gone. He had been replaced by a broken, terrified criminal, staring down the barrel of a life he had single-handedly obliterated. As the marshals pulled him down the center aisle, their path brought them directly past the plaintiff's table where I sat perfectly still. I did not look away. I maintained absolute, unflinching, terrifying eye contact without blinking. Brandon suddenly dug his heels into the marble floor, fighting against the iron grip of the officers just enough to momentarily stall his forward momentum. He looked at me with wide, bloodshot, devastated eyes, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged, uneven breaths. "Allison, please," Brandon begged, his voice cracking and dissolving into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed painfully through the emptying courtroom. "I only did it to protect my mother. I truly, genuinely love you." The marshals tightened their grip, preparing to force him forward without further delay. "Wait," I said quietly. The single word was soft, almost gentle, but it carried an undeniable and absolute authority. The marshals paused for a fraction of a second, instinctively granting me the floor without question. I rose slowly from my leather chair with deliberate composure. I glanced down at my tailored charcoal suit and calmly, precisely smoothed out the wrinkles across the front of my vest. Then I met his desperate, streaming eyes with a gaze colder and harder than a Chicago winter at midnight. I was the black sheep of his family's carefully constructed narrative, the woman they had unanimously decided they could easily manipulate, drain, and discard. But I was the one who had ended up holding every single key to his cage. "You do not love me," I stated, enunciating every syllable with deliberate, surgical precision, ensuring each word would echo in the hollows of his mind for the next 7 years. "You love the ATM with my name printed on it." Brandon sobbed louder, fresh tears cutting paths down his hollow cheeks. But I did not offer a single solitary ounce of pity, sympathy, or acknowledgement of his grief. "A piece of advice. Before you go to prison, Brandon," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, perfectly controlled, quiet register. "Next time you decide to steal from someone, do not choose a woman whose literal profession is throwing greedy men in expensive suits into concrete cells." I gave the federal marshals a single composed nod. "Take the trash out." The officers jerked Brandon forward without another moment of hesitation or ceremony. He wailed loudly, sobbing out my name in a long, broken cry, but the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with grim finality and swallowed him whole. The doors slammed shut behind him with a deep, resonant, heavy thud. The echo rolled through the chamber once, and then dissolved into absolute, complete silence. The courtroom was finally entirely empty of parasites. I reached down, collected my leather briefcase with one clean motion, turned to Harrison, and offered him a genuine, unhurried smile. The financial predator had been fully eradicated, and my empire stood safer, stronger, and more fortified than it had ever been before. The swift and brutal machinery of the federal justice system does not negotiate with arrogance. The moment those heavy wooden courtroom doors swung shut behind him, the fragile illusion of Brandon's superiority was shattered beyond any possibility of reconstruction. The violent transition from a life of manufactured luxury to absolute grinding destitution hit Brandon, Vanessa, and Brenda with the overwhelming, obliterating force of a runaway freight train traveling at full speed. There was no grace period extended to any of them. There was no comfortable, managed transition. There was only the harsh, merciless, unforgiving concrete of their brand new realities pressing in from every direction. Brandon was processed and transferred into a medium-security federal penitentiary located 500 miles from the affluent Chicago suburbs he had once prowled with such entitled confidence. The man who had previously dedicated hours each morning to perfectly styling his hair and agonizing meticulously over the exact break of his tailored trousers was stripped completely and ruthlessly of every element of his manufactured identity. He traded his carefully curated designer wardrobe for a scratchy, stiff khaki uniform that hung awkwardly and unflattering off his rapidly diminishing frame. The luxury timepieces he used to flash conspicuously at corporate board meetings were replaced by the cold, indifferent steel of standard-issue handcuffs during transport. His evenings of ordering imported steaks and premium craft beers at upscale Chicago restaurants were reduced to standing in a sterile, fluorescent-lit cafeteria line, waiting patiently for a tray of tasteless, mass-produced prison food that bore no resemblance to anything he had once considered acceptable. He was assigned a mandatory work detail in the facility laundry room, earning exactly 12 cents per hour for his labor. It was a moment of profound and deeply satisfying poetic justice. The slick regional sales director who had genuinely believed he could steal millions without consequence was now scrubbing the stained, worn uniforms of fellow inmates simply to afford a cheap bar of soap from the commissary. But the physical degradation of daily prison life was ultimately nothing when measured against his psychological torment. Brandon remained acutely, obsessively aware of the massive corporate restitution judgment waiting to consume him on the outside. Even if he managed to survive his full 7-year sentence intact, he would emerge on the other side as an unemployable convicted felon, permanently burdened by a $25 million civil judgment with compounding interest. Every single paycheck he might conceivably earn in whatever remained of his working life would be immediately and automatically garnished before it ever reached his hands. His financial ruin was not temporary. It was permanent, total, and entirely inescapable. He spent his long, sleepless nights lying flat on the narrow mattress of his cramped cell, staring blankly at the water-stained ceiling above him, replaying the precise sequence of decisions that had led him here. He had traded a comfortable, genuinely wealthy future for complete and total annihilation because he could not exercise the most basic, elementary control over his own insatiable greed. Vanessa experienced an equally catastrophic, equally deserved fall from grace in a women's correctional facility on the opposite side of the country. The woman who had cultivated and weaponized her social media following as a personal army of sympathizers was completely and permanently severed from the digital world that had fed her ego. Stripped of her smartphone, her carefully applied filters, and her elaborate fabricated victim narratives, she was rendered entirely invisible in the only arena where she had ever felt powerful. She was no longer a tragically misunderstood sister, valiantly fighting a cruel, wealthy tyrant. She was simply another federal inmate assigned a number and a bunk. The permanent loss of her young son to Taryn's custody completely shattered whatever fragile remaining sanity Vanessa had been clinging to behind her carefully maintained public facade. But rather than turning that pain inward and confronting the genuine consequences of her own choices, she directed every ounce of her corrosive venom outward at the only other person she could still reach. The bond between Brandon and Vanessa, once unified and reinforced by their shared parasitic appetites and mutual self-interest, violently and completely imploded under pressure. They turned on each other like two starving, wounded wolves locked together in an inescapable cage. During the rare, tightly monitored, strictly time-limited phone calls they were each permitted to make to their mother, they invested every precious available minute screaming accusations, denials, and blame across the prison telephone lines. Vanessa blamed Brandon furiously and repeatedly for introducing the catastrophic ransomware element into their scheme, cursing his monumental, unforgivable stupidity for escalating their operation far beyond what it needed to be, and ultimately destroying both their lives in the process. Brandon fired back viciously and without restraint, blaming Vanessa entirely for her reckless, breathtaking arrogance in targeting a federal honeypot account specifically designed to catch people exactly like them, bringing the full weight of the FBI directly and inescapably to their front door. There was no loyalty, no solidarity, and no compassion among these particular thieves. They tore each other apart with methodical, exhausting cruelty, their relationship dissolving entirely into a corrosive, irretrievable pool of mutual hatred and festering resentment. While her children rotted separately in their respective federal cells, Brenda faced a punishment that was in many ways arguably more psychologically devastating than a straightforward prison sentence would have been. Due to her genuinely deteriorating health and significantly advanced age, her defense attorney had managed to negotiate a highly restrictive plea arrangement that technically kept her body outside of a penitentiary's walls. But the agreement left her in a state of utter, comprehensive destitution that stripped away every comfort she had stolen over a lifetime of calculated fraud. Stripped entirely of her illegally obtained federal pension, her fraudulently claimed state benefits, and her luxury condominium, Brenda was effectively dumped without ceremony into the absolute bottom tier of urban society. She was relocated to a dilapidated, poorly maintained, low-income housing complex on the far-forgotten, desolate outskirts of the city, far removed from every neighborhood she had once claimed as her natural habitat. The woman who had once boldly and shamelessly demanded my king-size orthopedic mattress as if it were her rightful inheritance, now slept on a sagging, heavily stained futon she had retrieved from a local charity donation bin because she had no alternative. Her custom walk-in closets overflowing with designer clothing were replaced by a single cracked plastic dresser with two missing drawer handles. The walls of her cramped, perpetually dim apartment were coated in thick, bubbling, peeling paint and carried the permanent, inescapable smell of damp mildew and decades of stale cigarette smoke embedded in every surface. She had absolutely zero disposable income to speak of. Every single dollar she managed to scrape together through whatever means were available to her was closely and continuously monitored by a strict federal probation officer, ensuring that her mandatory restitution payments to the government were met before any personal expenses were considered. The total, absolute lack of discretionary funds meant that her severe, long-standing gambling addiction went entirely unmedicated and chronically, torturously unsatisfied. The physical and psychological withdrawal from the bright, pulsing lights and the hypnotic ringing bells of the casino floor left her shaking with uncontrollable tremors, chronically irritable, and profoundly, bottomlessly bitter about the trajectory her life had taken. She spent her hollow days seated in a badly frayed armchair positioned beneath the single working window of her apartment, staring blankly at the cracked plaster spreading across the ceiling above her, consumed entirely by the vivid, taunting memory of the wealth she had briefly touched with greedy, outstretched hands and then watched slip away into permanent darkness. Desperation steadily stripped away the last surviving tattered shreds of whatever pride she had once worn like armor. Brenda spent her gray, purposeless afternoons clutching a cheap prepaid mobile phone with arthritic hands, scrolling laboriously through an outdated, neglected contact list filled with names she had not spoken to in years. She called every distant cousin, every aging aunt, every remote relative she could still locate in her memory. She spun elaborate, tearful, carefully rehearsed lies about her catastrophically failing health and her heartless, ungrateful children who had abandoned her in her hour of greatest need, begging desperately for an emergency wire transfer or a small cash loan simply to cover basic groceries for the week. But the full documented truth about her massive federal fraud convictions and her decades of despicable, predatory behavior had spread through their extended family network with the unstoppable, comprehensive speed of wildfire moving through dry grass. Not a single person among them wished to be associated with, implicated alongside, or in any way connected to a convicted federal fraud artist and parasitic grifter of her particular caliber. Her desperate, increasingly frantic phone calls were met with a unified, impenetrable wall of icy, practiced rejection. Some relatives would simply hang up the instant they recognized her distinctive, plaintive, wheedling voice on the other end of the line. Others did not even grant her the courtesy of answering, routing her calls directly to voicemail without a second thought. And eventually, inevitably, she began hearing the flat, mechanical, automated tones indicating that her number had been permanently, deliberately blocked. Rejected even by the distant peripheral people she had once boasted to about her children's imaginary successes and her own fabricated prosperity. Brenda was completely and utterly isolated, a social pariah reduced to living in genuine squalor, entirely forgotten and discarded by the very world she had spent decades trying to manipulate and exploit for personal gain. The family that had approached my empire with such breathtaking arrogance and naked entitlement had thoroughly, comprehensively destroyed themselves from the inside out. They had been crushed beneath the overwhelming, suffocating weight of their own monumental greed, left with absolutely nothing but the miserable, haunting company of their accumulated failures and the echoing silence of consequences they had earned every single step of the way. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Chicago was bathed in the warm, luminous golden glow of cascading crystal chandeliers suspended high above the gleaming marble floor. The sheer, unapologetic opulence of the evening stood as a stark and breathtaking contrast to the chaotic, trash-filled driveway I had left behind exactly 12 months ago. Tonight was the annual gala celebrating the unprecedented, remarkable expansion of my financial forensics firm, an expansion that no one who had witnessed our circumstances a year prior could have predicted with any confidence. We had not merely survived the calculated, malicious sabotage attempted by a mediocre regional sales director and his parasitic, entitled family. We had weaponized that entire sordid encounter entirely, transforming the spectacular wreckage of his ransomware attack into the single most powerful and effective marketing campaign our firm had ever produced. The message it sent to the corporate world was unmistakable. We were not only impenetrable, we were the people you called when you needed someone else's defenses dismantled with surgical precision. In the span of 365 days, my company had undergone a complete and total transformation that exceeded even my most ambitious projections. We had tripled our operational capacity from the ground up, leasing 3 additional floors in our glass and steel high-rise tower to accommodate the massive, steady influx of prestigious new corporate contracts arriving from across the country and beyond. I had aggressively recruited the finest available talent from every corner of the nation, bringing on board former federal investigators with decades of field experience, elite cybersecurity architects who had built systems for government intelligence agencies, and ruthless corporate litigators whose courtroom records spoke for themselves without embellishment. My firm was no longer simply a highly respected and well-regarded forensic auditing agency operating within the boundaries of the Midwest. We had evolved into something altogether more formidable. We had become the absolute, undisputed terror of Wall Street. Corrupt hedge fund managers, quietly embezzling chief executives, and sophisticated offshore money launderers now whispered my name in closed-door meetings with genuine, paralyzing fear threading through every syllable. They understood with crystalline clarity that if my team was contracted to audit their ledgers and examine their operations, there existed no bribe substantial enough and no digital firewall sophisticated enough to keep their buried secrets permanently hidden from our reach. Just the previous month, we had orchestrated the total and comprehensive financial dismantling of a multi-billion-dollar investment group headquartered in New York. The executives at the helm of that organization had been supremely confident that they could successfully conceal their phantom assets inside decentralized cryptocurrency wallets and an elaborate labyrinth of complex shell corporations registered across 4 different continents. It took my newly expanded cyber division exactly 4 working days to map their entire illicit network in complete detail, freeze every shadow account they had constructed over years of careful maneuvering, and deliver a perfectly compiled, meticulously documented evidence dossier directly into the waiting hands of the Securities and Exchange Commission. That single operation produced a dozen federal indictments and permanently cemented our standing as the undisputed apex predators of the financial forensics sector. Tonight was a celebration of precisely that kind of uncompromising, unforgiving excellence. I moved through the crowded, luminous ballroom holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne with effortless composure. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue evening gown that swept elegantly across the polished marble floor with every measured step I took. High-profile clients, bank presidents, and corporate board members parted instinctively like the Red Sea as I approached, each of them eager to extend a hand and express their profound, heartfelt gratitude for the role my firm had played in shielding their shareholders from potential financial catastrophe. I accepted their praise with the cool, composed, completely unforced confidence of a woman who owned her reality entirely and without reservation. Harrison stood near the grand staircase, unhurriedly swirling a glass of aged single malt scotch and observing the room with the proud, calculating gaze of a legal warlord surveying conquered territory. When his eyes found mine across the crowded room, he raised his glass in a quiet, deeply respectful, silent toast. We had fought together in the same trenches, navigating the vile, relentless attacks of a parasitic family with unified resolve, and we had emerged from that conflict completely and decisively victorious. He understood better than any other person present in that ballroom precisely what it had taken. Every sleepless night, every calculated move, every moment of controlled fury, to construct this fortress from the foundation upward. I returned his nod with measured acknowledgement, honoring the unbreakable bond that had been forged between us in the fires of absolute corporate warfare. A soft, clear chime resonated through the ballroom's sound system, signaling the main event of the evening with elegant understatement. The dull, sophisticated roar of elite networking conversations instantly fell away to attentive quiet. Hundreds of powerful, influential, carefully selected guests redirected their full attention toward the elevated stage positioned at the front of the room. I handed my champagne flute to a passing server with a quiet word of thanks, smoothed the fabric of my gown with one practiced motion, and walked with quiet confidence up the illuminated steps to the stage. I stepped behind the sleek acrylic podium and adjusted the microphone to its proper height. The room had reached a level of silence so complete and absolute that the faint tinkling of crystal glasses at the rear bar was audible from the stage. I looked out over the assembled sea of expectant faces. These were the genuine titans of industry, the individuals and institutions that controlled billions of dollars in global assets across every major market. And every single one of them was waiting, quietly and without restlessness, for me to speak. I did not require notes. I had no need of a teleprompter or carefully rehearsed talking points. The words rose from a place of absolute, hard-earned, deeply personal truth. "Good evening," I began, my voice projecting clearly and with authority across the vast, high-ceilinged ballroom. 1 year ago, I stood at a genuine personal and professional crossroads, unlike anything I had encountered in my career. I was presented with a very specific, highly aggressive, and deliberately orchestrated threat aimed directly at everything I had spent years building with my own hands. A group of individuals attempted to infiltrate my home, systematically compromise my business operations, and strip me of my assets by exploiting the disguise of familial trust as their primary weapon of access. They operated on the assumption that my singular dedication to my professional work had rendered me blind to the threats developing within my immediate surroundings. They were convinced that empathy and perceived legal obligation would ultimately compel me to voluntarily surrender my empire to their sheer, weaponized entitlement. I paused deliberately, allowing my gaze to sweep across the front row of corporate executives, meeting eyes with several before continuing. In the world of finance, we are trained and conditioned to assess risk through the familiar lenses of market volatility, inflation rates, and geopolitical instability. I continued, my tone sharpening to a fine, resonant edge. But the greatest threat to any empire, any enterprise, any institution, is never external market pressure or macroeconomic disruption. The greatest threat is the parasite that successfully bypasses your security protocols by convincingly presenting itself as a valued asset. In business and in life, the most dangerous and destructive liabilities are invariably the ones wearing a warm, friendly smile, seated at your own dinner table, demanding unrestricted access to your hard-earned capital while contributing absolutely nothing of genuine, measurable value in return. My voice expanded, filling every corner and recess of the grand room with unwavering conviction. We did not triple the operational size of this firm by being accommodating when accommodation was unwarranted. We did not ascend to the position of premier forensic auditing agency in this country by extending second chances to those who had demonstrated they would exploit every one of them. We built this powerhouse by ruthlessly and without sentiment identifying the rot wherever it existed and cutting it out with decisive, unhesitating precision. We built this by categorically refusing to accept the role of victim. We demonstrated, conclusively and publicly, that when you stop negotiating with parasites and instead aggressively defend the boundaries you have every right to hold, the potential for expansion and growth becomes genuinely, spectacularly limitless. The crowd rose as one and erupted into a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. The applause was deafening, a massive, rolling wave of validation and recognition from the most consequential people assembled in the city that evening. I stood at the podium and allowed the sound to wash over me without retreating from it. I had taken the worst, most humiliating and deeply personal betrayal of my life and forged it, through discipline and focused fury, into an indestructible armor of corporate dominance that no future adversary would find easy to penetrate. But I was acutely and gratefully aware that I had not constructed this newly expanded empire alone. I raised one hand, signaling graciously for the applause to subside so that I could deliver the final and most meaningful introduction of the evening. It was time to bring my greatest and most essential ally into the spotlight he had fully and genuinely earned. The thunderous applause swept once more across the grand ballroom before quieting to a respectful, attentive hush at the gentle gesture of my raised hand. I surveyed the assembled sea of elite corporate executives, senior federal investigators, and financial titans, fully conscious that not one element of this extraordinary expansion would have been achievable without the man standing composed and ready near the edge of the stage. Building an empire demands vision, relentless discipline, and the courage to act when others hesitate. But protecting it, sustaining it against those who want what you have built, requires an unbreakable, tested, and ruthless loyalty that cannot be manufactured or performed. I leaned into the microphone, my voice carrying the weight of profound and entirely genuine respect. I want to introduce you to the architect of our newly fortified and expanded financial fortress. When I found myself needing to dismantle a highly organized, sophisticated syndicate of domestic fraud operating from within my own inner circle, I did not reach for the phone to call law enforcement first. I called a man whose brilliance with a financial ledger is surpassed only by his absolute, unwavering integrity under pressure. He is the single most significant reason our firm is currently inspiring carefully concealed terror in the most corrupt boardrooms operating on Wall Street today. Please welcome my most trusted colleague, our Chief Financial Officer, Terrence. The ballroom detonated into a second wave of applause, broader and more genuinely enthusiastic than even the first had been. Terrence stepped forward from the wings and walked up the illuminated stairs to the stage with the unhurried, commanding stride of someone entirely at ease with being precisely where they belonged. He bore no resemblance whatsoever to the exhausted, financially abused, emotionally depleted man who had called me in a state of quiet panic at 2 a.m. 1 year ago. Tonight, he radiated something closer to absolute royalty. He wore an immaculate, custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders with the perfection of something made specifically and exclusively for him. His posture was commanding without being aggressive, projecting the quiet, lethal, undemonstrative confidence of a man who held the financial architecture of a multi-million-dollar agency entirely within his capable hands. He took his place beside me at the podium, looked out at the assembled crowd of powerful executives and banking heavyweights who now actively and eagerly sought his professional counsel, and offered the room a sharp, genuinely charismatic smile that disarmed the entire space within seconds. "Thank you, Allison," Terrence began, his deep, resonant voice filling the grand room with effortless authority. "A year ago, I was forced to learn a very harsh and clarifying lesson about the true nature of investments. I learned that it is entirely possible to pour every unit of your available capital, every hour of your irreplaceable time, and every ounce of your carefully placed trust into a partnership, only to discover with devastating clarity that the other party has been systematically, deliberately siphoning your resources away to fund their own toxic and unsustainable personal liabilities. In the financial sector, we assign that a precise and unambiguous designation: catastrophic bad debt. In the context of personal life, we call it a tragedy. But the enduring, immovable beauty of a properly maintained balance sheet is that it never lies, never flatters, and never accommodates fiction. Numbers do not respond to manipulation, however sophisticated or emotionally compelling that manipulation may be. They do not yield to manufactured tears or carefully constructed victim narratives designed to elicit sympathy and buy time. The numbers, ultimately and without exception, simply demand a reckoning, and they always receive one. A warm ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the audience, completely captivated by his effortless and natural command of the room and everyone in it. When you identify a liability that has grown large enough and corrosive enough to genuinely threaten the survival of your entire operation, the appropriate response is not to open negotiations with it. Terence continued, his tone sharpening and growing more deliberate and resolute with each sentence. You do not offer it a structured payment plan or a grace period it has not remotely earned. You cut it off cleanly and completely at the source. You freeze the accounts. And then you permanently and thoughtfully restructure your enterprise around the foundation of what actually works and what actually deserves to grow. That is precisely what Allison and I did, together and without hesitation. We extracted the liabilities that had positioned themselves to destroy us from within, and we reinvested every unit of reclaimed energy and redirected resource into a genuine partnership built entirely on verifiable merit and demonstrated competence. We built a family here, not one assembled through the random, unchosen accident of bloodlines or the hollow formality of legal contracts, but one constructed deliberately and consciously on the bedrock of competence, honesty, and a shared and uncompromising dedication to absolute excellence in everything we undertake. He turned his head and looked directly at me with an expression that carried more weight and genuine meaning than any formal declaration could have contained. His eyes communicated a deep, unambiguous platonic love and a mutual respect so profound and so thoroughly tested that no parasite, however sophisticated, could ever hope to fully comprehend or replicate it. We had navigated the same nightmare together, fought our battles from the same trenches, and emerged on the other side as the undisputed architects of our own remarkable making. To Allison, Terence said, raising his crystal flute of champagne with unhurried ceremony high into the luminous air above the stage. A visionary leader, a ruthless and unwavering protector, and the truest and most genuine family I have ever had the privilege of knowing. May our ledgers remain permanently and perfectly balanced, and may our enemies remain forever and irrevocably bankrupt. I stepped forward and raised my own glass to meet his with steady hands and steady eyes. The sharp, crystalline chime of our flute's meeting rang cleanly through the open microphone and into every corner of the ballroom. A single, perfect musical note of absolute and complete victory. To the Empire, I replied, holding the steady, unblinking gaze of the finest chief financial officer in the country. The ballroom erupted into a final, sustained wave of celebration. Glasses were raised in every direction across the room, honoring the unstoppable alliance we had forged from the raw material of shared adversity and mutual trust. The string quartet positioned in the far corner of the ballroom launched immediately and brilliantly into a lively, triumphant composition that seemed to fill the air itself with momentum. The gala was in full, magnificent swing, a dazzling, unapologetic display of earned wealth, cultivated power, and genuinely untouchable success built on a foundation that could withstand any assault. The people who had once conspired to steal all of this from us were, at this precise moment, sitting in concrete federal cells or quietly deteriorating in dilapidated public housing on the forgotten margins of the city, completely and permanently erased from our reality and our future. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my vintage champagne, allowing the cold, crisp, perfectly balanced taste to settle on my tongue for a long moment. I looked upward at the glittering chandeliers throwing warm light across the ceiling, then out at the smiling, energized faces of my exceptional staff and the vibrant, thriving, chosen family I had deliberately and carefully assembled around me over years of discernment. I handed my glass to Terence with a quiet, knowing smile that required no accompanying words, and stepped down from the illuminated stage with the unhurried composure of someone who had nowhere more important to be and nothing left to prove. The lively energy of the ballroom gradually faded to a muffled, warm, distant hum as I walked with quiet purpose across the polished marble floor and moved away from the crowd, stepping through into the softly lit, tranquil corridor of the Grand Hotel. I stopped. I turned. I looked directly forward, locking my gaze straight into the lens of the camera, and with complete and deliberate intention shattered the fourth wall entirely. Marriage can be a graveyard if you blindly and without scrutiny invite parasites through its gates, I stated, my voice smooth, measured, cold, and carrying the absolute certainty of someone who has navigated that graveyard and emerged from the other side intact. You can dedicate your entire life to building a true sanctuary, a place of safety, abundance, and genuine peace, only to watch it be systematically dismantled by people who have become extraordinarily skilled at disguising their bottomless greed as familial love and emotional need. I took a single, slow, deliberate step closer to the lens, my expression settling into the look of someone who has learned every lesson the hardest possible way and retained every single one of them. But fortunately, and I mean this with complete sincerity, the sheer spectacular arrogance of my near mother-in-law delivered me a gift I could not have manufactured or engineered on my own. She was so profoundly and irreparably blinded by her own entitlement that she cleared the exact path I needed to dismantle her entire family's fraudulent operation and throw every one of them directly into the garbage where they belonged. She was entirely convinced I would roll over quietly and accommodate her demands. She genuinely believed I would be a good, quiet, grateful, compliant bride who would consider herself lucky for the association. Instead, she handed me the precise matches I needed and then watched helplessly as I used them to burn everything they had constructed to the ground. I smoothed the lapel of my midnight blue gown with one hand, a sharp and knowing smile settling unhurriedly on my lips. So, ladies, listen to me carefully, because I will not repeat this. Buy your own houses and keep the deeds in your name alone. Guard your financial assets and your personal accounts with the same ferocity you would guard anything irreplaceable. Never merge your hard-earned wealth with a man who frames your financial submission as a reasonable compromise or a natural expression of partnership. And above all else, never allow anyone or anything to make you afraid of becoming precisely as cold-blooded as the situation genuinely requires. The greatest and most enduring lesson this entire ordeal delivered to me is this. True, sustainable security is built on absolute financial independence and boundaries that do not bend under social pressure or emotional manipulation. Society exerts enormous and relentless pressure on women to compromise their hard-earned professional success and personal sovereignty in the name of love, harmony, or the preservation of family peace. But sharing a life with someone, however deeply and genuinely, does not grant that person or their family any claim over the resources you built before they arrived, or the empire you continue to build while they stand beside you. When people reveal their true character to you through entitlement, disrespect, and deliberate exploitation, you must believe what they are showing you immediately and without the softening filter of wishful thinking. Never sacrifice your instincts on the altar of keeping a peace that was never truly yours to keep. True family, the kind worth protecting and worth building toward, is constructed on the foundation of mutual respect, demonstrated integrity, and actions that consistently align with words. Not on financial leverage, manufactured obligation, or the quiet violence of manipulation dressed as love. Protect your peace and your assets with everything you have. Both of them are worth exactly that.